Alexandria, 2nd century CE. The sea wind carries the smell of papyrus and salt. In a candlelit room above the harbour, a scribe dips his reed pen into ink and draws a cross, not of suffering, but of light. The world is crucified upon it, he writes. Outside, soldiers hunt those who carry such marks. Centuries later, archaeologists in Nag Hammadi will unseal the same symbol from clay jars, its lines whispering of rebellion against heaven itself. What did they mean? That the cross was not a punishment, but a map of the universe? This is the story of how an ancient emblem was reimagined by heretics, suppressed by empires, and rediscovered by scholars, a secret geometry connecting flesh and spirit. The question remains, was the cross meant to save the world or expose it? The cross existed as an instrument of terror long before it became a symbol of hope. In the 1st and 2nd centuries of the Common Era, the Roman Empire stretched across 3 continents, its roads connecting distant provinces in a vast network of commerce, communication, and control. These roads intersected at regular intervals, forming crosses visible from the air, patterns of empire etched into the earth itself. At these intersections, travellers might encounter crucified bodies, left to rot as warnings against rebellion, theft, or desertion. The empire built its authority on such displays, transforming the landscape itself into a canvas of intimidation. Crucifixion was not merely execution, it was theatre. The condemned were paraded through streets, forced to carry the horizontal beam, the patibulum, upon their shoulders. Crowds gathered to witness these processions, some jeering, others watching in silent horror. The vertical post, the stipe, stood permanently embedded at execution sites outside city walls, waiting to receive its burden. When the 2 beams joined, they formed the shape that would haunt human consciousness for millennia. The mechanics of crucifixion were brutally efficient. Roman executioners had perfected their craft over centuries. They used olive wood beams, dense and durable, capable of supporting human weight for days. The question of nails versus ropes divided scholarly opinion for generations, but archaeological evidence from the mid-20th century settled the debate. In 1968, construction workers near Jerusalem unearthed an ossuary containing the bones of a young man named Yehohanan. A 7-inch iron nail remained lodged through his heel bone, driven through the side of the olive wood beam. The Romans used both methods, selecting nails for additional humiliation and certainty. The condemned hung suspended between earth and sky, unable to stand yet unable to fall. Breathing became an agonizing choice. Push up on shattered feet to fill the lungs, then slump forward as muscles failed, only to repeat the cycle. Death came slowly, sometimes taking days, the result of asphyxiation, shock, exposure, or infection. The body remained on. Display after death, left for carrion birds and wild dogs, denied the dignity of burial that ancient peoples considered essential for the soul's journey beyond life. For the earliest followers of the executed Jewish teacher from Nazareth, the cross represented an unbearable paradox. Their master had spoken of love, healing, and the kingdom of heaven. He had touched lepers, dined with outcasts, and challenged the authorities with parables and provocations. Then he had been arrested, tried, and condemned to die in the manner reserved for the empire's most despised criminals. The cross was not a symbol to be embraced, but a horror to be processed, a trauma requiring explanation. Early Christian communities struggled with this central difficulty. How could the Messiah, the anointed king who would restore Israel and inaugurate God's reign, have died the death of a slave? Jewish scripture contained no precedent for a crucified redeemer. Crucifixion was explicitly cursed in Deuteronomy. Anyone hung on a tree is under God's curse. The followers of Jesus faced mockery from both Jews and Romans. To Jews, a crucified Messiah was a contradiction in terms. To Romans, the crucifixion proved Jesus had been nothing more than another failed revolutionary, his movement destined to scatter like so many others. Yet the movement did not scatter. Instead, it grew, spreading through the ports and roads of the Mediterranean world with remarkable speed. Within decades, communities of believers existed in Jerusalem, Antioch, Ephesus, Corinth, and Rome itself. These communities told and retold the story of the crucifixion, but they told it differently than one might expect. They did not speak of defeat but of victory, not of shame but of glory. The cross, they insisted, had accomplished something cosmic in scope, something that transcended the brutal mechanics of Roman execution. This transformation of meaning did not occur in a vacuum. The Roman world of the 1st and 2nd centuries teemed with religious and philosophical movements, each offering explanations for human suffering and paths to transcendence. Greek philosophy had long taught that the material world was inferior to the realm of eternal forms or ideas. Orphic mysteries promised initiates liberation from the cycle of reincarnation. Egyptian religion spoke of death and resurrection through the myth of Osiris. Persian Zoroastrianism described a cosmic struggle between light and darkness, order and chaos. Jewish apocalyptic literature envisioned a coming transformation, when God would overthrow earthly kingdoms and establish divine justice. Into this churning marketplace of ideas came teachers who blended elements from multiple traditions, creating new syntheses. They asked questions that traditional Jewish monotheism and emerging Christian orthodoxy found difficult to answer. If God is good and all-powerful, why does creation contain so much suffering and evil? Why does the material world seem to trap and corrupt the soul? If Jesus was divine, did he truly suffer on the cross, or was his suffering somehow illusory? These questions would not go away. They demanded responses that went beyond conventional answers. The cross, that intersection of vertical and horizontal beams, began to suggest something beyond its Roman function. For minds trained in Greek geometry and mystical speculation, the cross could represent the meeting point of heaven and earth, spirit and matter, time and eternity. The vertical beam might symbolize the divine descending into creation, or the soul ascending toward transcendence. The horizontal beam might represent the material world, the plane of time and space where human life unfolds. The point where they met, the center of the cross, became charged with meaning as the place where opposites coincide, where the impossible becomes possible. But if the cross was a symbol of cosmic architecture rather than merely an instrument of execution, then its meaning depended on how one understood the cosmos itself. And here profound disagreements emerged. Some teachers argued that the material world was inherently good, created by the one true God, and that the cross represented God's willingness to enter fully into physical suffering to redeem creation from within. Others argued that the material world was a prison or a mistake, created by a lesser deity or even a malevolent force, and that the cross represented something else entirely, perhaps a revelation of the material world's illusory nature, or a cosmic disruption that opened a pathway for souls to escape. These competing interpretations would shape the development of Christianity for centuries. But in the 1st and 2nd centuries, before orthodoxy had fully crystallized, before councils had defined doctrine and emperors had enforced uniformity, a remarkable diversity flourished. Teachers traveled from city to city, offering their own readings of Scripture and their own visions of salvation. Some of these teachers would later be remembered as saints and church fathers. Others would be condemned as heretics, their writings burned, their names remembered only through the accusations of their opponents. The cross stood at the center of these debates, its meaning contested, its symbolism unresolved. Was it primarily a historical event, the execution of one man at a specific time and place, or was it a timeless symbol of cosmic realities? Was the suffering of Jesus on the cross the essential point, or was the suffering somehow secondary to a deeper hidden meaning? Could the cross be both a Roman execution device and a mystical diagram of the universe? These questions would drive some of the most creative and controversial theological speculation in human history. The movements that would later be labelled Gnostic did not emerge fully formed from a single source. Instead, they represented a convergence of influences, a synthesis of ideas that drew from multiple traditions. to understand Gnostic interpretations of the cross, we must first understand the intellectual soil from which these interpretations grew. Greek philosophy, particularly the tradition flowing from Plato, provided crucial conceptual frameworks. Plato had taught that the physical world was a dim reflection of a higher reality, the realm of eternal forms or ideas. Everything we perceive with our senses is impermanent and imperfect, he argued, a shadow cast by true reality. The human soul, Plato believed, belonged originally to that higher realm, but had fallen or descended into a physical body. The body was a tomb or prison for the soul, and the philosopher's task was to turn away from sensory deception and remember the eternal truths known before birth. Later Platonists elaborated these ideas. Middle Platonism, flourishing in the 1st and 2nd centuries CE, emphasized the transcendence of the supreme God, who was so far above creation that he could not directly interact with matter. Between the supreme God and the material world, these philosophers posited intermediate beings, demons or divine emanations, that served as mediators. This hierarchical vision of reality, with multiple levels of divinity descending from an unknowable source, would profoundly influence Gnostic cosmology. From Persia came dualistic concepts that would also shape Gnostic thought. Zoroastrianism presented the cosmos as a battleground between two opposing forces: Ahura Mazda, the god of light, truth and order, and Angra Mainyu, the spirit of darkness, lies and chaos. Though Zoroastrian theology maintained that Ahura Mazda would ultimately triumph, the religion took seriously the reality and power of evil in the present age. This cosmic dualism, the idea that good and evil, light and darkness, spirit and matter, stood in fundamental opposition, resonated with people trying to make sense of a world that seemed thoroughly corrupted. Egyptian religion contributed its own elements. The ancient wisdom traditions of Egypt, with their elaborate mythologies and mysteries, fascinated Greek and Roman intellectuals. Hermes Trismegistus, thrice great Hermes, was imagined as an Egyptian sage of immense antiquity who had written secret texts revealing the nature of the cosmos and methods for ascending through the planetary spheres. The Hermetic writings, composed in Greek in the 1st century CE, but attributed to this mythical ancient Egyptian, blended Greek philosophy with Egyptian symbolism. They taught that the cosmos was a vast living organism, that humanity possessed a divine spark trapped in matter, and that knowledge, gnosis, was the key to liberation. Jewish apocalyptic literature added another layer. Books like Daniel, Enoch, and various apocalypses described visions of heaven, angelic hierarchies, cosmic warfare, and the coming end of the present evil age. These texts often featured a revealer figure, an angel or exalted human who transported the visionary through the heavens, explaining the structure of reality and the plan of God. The apocalyptic worldview divided history into ages. The present age was under the dominion of evil powers, but God would soon intervene to establish a new age of righteousness. This temporal dualism, present evil versus future redemption, complemented the spatial dualism of heaven versus earth. From these diverse sources emerged teachers who synthesized elements into new religious visions. Later Christian heresiologists would remember some of these teachers as the first Gnostics, though the teachers themselves likely did not use that label. They were prophets, philosophers, mystics, and poets, each offering their distinctive understanding of humanity's predicament and path to salvation. Simon Magus appears in the New Testament book of Acts as a magician from Samaria who attempts to purchase spiritual power from the apostles. Later Christian writers expanded his story, making him the father of all heresies. According to hostile accounts, Simon claimed to be a manifestation of God himself, specifically the Great Power. He travelled with a woman named Helena, whom he identified as his first thought, the divine wisdom who had descended into matter and become trapped in successive reincarnations, most recently as a prostitute. Simon's teachings, as filtered through his opponents, described creation as the result of fallen angels who sought to imprison humanity in material bodies. Redemption required recognizing one's true divine identity and rejecting the claims of these false authorities. Basilides, teaching in Alexandria around 120–140 CE, developed an elaborate cosmology featuring 365 heavens arranged in descending levels. At the summit stood the supreme, unknowable Father. From this Father emanated mind, then word, then prudence, then wisdom and power, and from these angels who created the first heaven. This process continued through multiple levels until the angels of the lowest heaven, ignorant of the realms above them, created the material world. The God of the Jews, Basilides suggested, was merely one of these lower angels, powerful within his limited domain, but ignorant of the true supreme God. Jesus, in Basilidan thought, was an apparition who never truly took physical form and therefore never truly suffered. At the crucifixion, Simon of Cyrene was magically transformed to look like Jesus and was crucified in his place while Jesus stood by laughing at the cosmic joke. Carpocrates, teaching in Alexandria roughly contemporaneously with Basilides, emphasized the divine nature of the human soul. He taught that Jesus was a human being who had remembered his divine origin and thus escaped the tyranny of the creator angels. Other humans could achieve the same liberation by rejecting the moral laws created by these lesser powers. Carpocratian teaching led to accusations of libertinism, the idea that since the material world and its laws were creations of ignorant powers, the truly enlightened could transgress those laws without spiritual consequence. These teachers and others like them shared certain recurring themes, though they differed dramatically in details. They tended to view the material world negatively, as a prison, trap or mistake rather than the good creation of a benevolent God. They distinguished between the supreme transcendent God, utterly remote and unknown, and the creator of the material world, whom they often identified with the God of the Hebrew Bible. They taught that humans contain a divine spark or spirit, a fragment of the higher reality trapped in matter. And they emphasized gnosis, knowledge or insight, as the means of salvation. This knowledge was not mere intellectual information, but a transformative recognition of one's true identity and origin. Alexandria, where several of these teachers flourished, was the perfect incubator for such syntheses. Founded by Alexander the Great in 381 BCE, Alexandria had become the intellectual capital of the Mediterranean world. Its famous library and museum attracted scholars from across the empire. Egyptian priests, Greek philosophers, Jewish rabbis, and Christian teachers all inhabited the same city, their ideas cross-pollinating. The Jewish philosopher Philo, who lived in Alexandria in the 1st century CE, had already pioneered the allegorical interpretation of Scripture, reading the Hebrew Bible through Platonic concepts. Christian teachers in Alexandria would continue this tradition, finding multiple levels of meaning in sacred texts. The atmosphere in Alexandria combined intellectual excitement with genuine danger, ideas that questioned traditional authorities, whether Roman, Jewish, or increasingly Christian, could bring persecution. Teachers coded their messages in mythological narratives, symbolic language, and secret teachings reserved for advanced students. The boundary between philosophy and religion blurred. What today might be called theology, philosophy, psychology, and physics were integrated into comprehensive visions of reality. In this ferment of ideas, the cross acquired new meanings. It could no longer be merely the device on which Jesus died. It became a symbol to be decoded, a mystery to be penetrated. What did it mean, really? What cosmic truth did it reveal? As teachers pondered these questions, the cross began to represent not just an event in history, but a structure of reality itself. Among the teachers who reimagined the cross, Valentinus stands out for the sophistication of his system and the extent of his influence. Born in Egypt around 100 CE, educated in Alexandria, Valentinus eventually travelled to Rome, where he taught from approximately 136 to 165 CE. According to later reports, he nearly became Bishop of Rome, the position we would now call the Pope, losing by a narrow margin to a candidate who held more conventional views. Whether or not this story is accurate, it indicates the respect Valentinus commanded and the degree to which his teaching circulated in mainstream Christian communities. Valentinus was a poet as well as a theologian. His surviving fragments display a mystical visionary quality. He wrote of divine emanations, cosmic dramas, and the soul's journey through spheres of archons, cosmic rulers who sought to keep humanity in ignorance. His system was complex, perhaps deliberately so, creating layers of meaning that revealed themselves only to serious students. At the heart of Valentinian cosmology stood the pleroma, fullness, the realm of divine perfection. The pleroma consisted of 30 aeons, divine beings arranged in male-female pairs called syzygies. At the highest level stood depth and silence, the primal divine pair. From them emanated mind and truth, then word and life, then human and church. These first 8 aeons constituted the primary Ogdoad. Below them came additional emanations, each pair producing others in a cascading hierarchy of divine consciousness. The youngest aeon was Sophia, wisdom. She became possessed by a passion to know the unknowable Supreme Father directly, without a consort, transgressing the proper order. This desire produced a disturbance in the pleroma. From Sophia's passion came an abortion, a formless entity expelled from the divine realm. This expelled entity, eventually named Akamoth, would become the mother of the demiurge, the creator of the material world. The demiurge, ignorant of the pleroma above him, believed himself to be the supreme god. He created the material universe and fashioned humanity, placing the divine spark, fragments of Sophia, within human beings without knowing what he had done. Thus humans contain something divine that even the creator God does not fully understand. The purpose of Christ's mission, in Valentinian teaching, was to remind humans of their true origin and provide the knowledge needed to return to the pleroma. Within this elaborate mythology, Valentinus assigned the cross a central role. He called it stauros, the Greek word for cross, but also for stake, pole, or upright beam. In Valentinian theology, stauros was personified as a divine being, an aeon who served as the boundary or limit of the pleroma. When Sophia's passion threatened to destabilize the divine realm, stauros intervened, establishing a boundary between the pleroma and the deficiency outside it. The cross thus became the limit that separated divine fullness from material lack, light from darkness, knowledge from ignorance. But stauros was not merely a barrier, it was also a crossing point, a place of intersection where what had been separated could be reunited. The vertical beam of the cross represented the axis connecting the divine realm above with the material world below, the channel through which saving knowledge descended and through which awakened souls ascended. The horizontal beam represented the boundary or limit itself, the line dividing fullness from emptiness. At the intersection, the center point of the cross, the two dimensions met. This center represented Christ, the revealer who crossed from the pleroma into the material world to rescue the divine sparks trapped within humanity. Valentinian Christians saw the crucifixion as a symbolic enactment of cosmic realities. The physical cross on Golgotha corresponded to the cosmic stauros. When Christ was crucified, he was not primarily experiencing Roman execution, but demonstrating the structure of reality itself. The cross revealed that salvation required crossing from ignorance to knowledge, from matter to spirit, from the domain of the demiurge to the pleroma of the true God. This interpretation dramatically altered the meaning of Jesus' death. For proto-Orthodox Christians, the crucifixion was primarily about atonement. Jesus dying for the sins of humanity, paying a debt, satisfying divine justice, or defeating demonic powers through his sacrificial death. For Valentinians, while these interpretations might have secondary value, the primary meaning of the cross was revelatory. It was not that Jesus suffered and died to change God's disposition toward humanity. Rather, Jesus revealed through the cross the path that all spirits must take, the vertical ascent through the archonic spheres crossing the boundary from material entrapment to spiritual freedom. The Valentinian Gospel of Truth, possibly written by Valentinus himself, presents this understanding in poetic language. When it pleased him, that which was pleasing to the Father, the Word, the one who came forth from the mouth, became flesh. The deficiency was filled by him, and he became a pleroma for those who are deficient. The text describes Jesus as bringing knowledge that destroys ignorance. Ignorance of the Father brought about anguish and terror, and the anguish grew solid like a fog so that no one was able to see. For this reason, error became powerful. Against this terror, Jesus brought gnosis, dispelling the fog of ignorance. The cross in this text functions as the instrument of enlightenment. It is where error is nailed and destroyed, where the fog of ignorance dissipates. But the emphasis is not on physical suffering. The text never dwells on the pain of crucifixion. Instead, it focuses on the revelation of truth and the joy of recognition. Those who receive this knowledge are no longer identified with their bodies or the material world. They recognize their true identity as divine sparks belonging to the pleroma. Valentinus's Tripartite Tractate, another text from the Valentinian school, elaborates the cosmic drama further. It describes in detail the emanation of aeons, the fall of Sophia, the creation of the material world, and the eventual restoration of all things to the pleroma. The cross appears as the point of return, the axis along which scattered divine fragments reassemble and ascend. Valentinian teachers develop complex diagrams to illustrate these concepts. Though none survive from the 2nd century, descriptions from opponents and later Gnostic manuscripts suggest they featured concentric circles representing the pleroma and its emanations, with the cross inscribed at the centre. Rays extended from the centre toward the periphery, representing the emanation of aeons. The vertical axis showed the path of descent and ascent. The horizontal axis showed the boundary established by Stauros. These diagrams were not mere illustrations but meditation tools. By contemplating the geometry of the divine, students could internalize the cosmic architecture and recognize their place within it. The cross became a map for mystical ascent, a visual representation of the journey from ignorance to knowledge, from materiality to divinity. Valentinian Christianity attracted many followers. Its intellectual sophistication appealed to educated converts. Its promise of secret knowledge reserved for the initiated created a sense of spiritual elitism. Its complex mythology provided answers to difficult questions. Why is there evil? Why do we suffer? What happens after death? The system offered a complete worldview that integrated Greek philosophy, Jewish scripture, and Christian revelation into a grand synthesis. But this very sophistication and divergence from simpler forms of Christian teaching would make Valentinianism a target. Other Christian leaders, seeking to establish unified doctrine and church structure, viewed Valentinus and his followers with increasing alarm. The battle lines were being drawn for a conflict that would reshape Christianity and determine which interpretations of the cross would survive and which would be suppressed. By the mid-2nd century, Christian communities faced a crisis of definition. The movement had spread throughout the Roman Empire, establishing churches in cities and towns from Britain to Mesopotamia, from North Africa to Asia Minor. But Christianity had no centralized hierarchy, no universally accepted creed, no fixed canon of scripture, and no agreed-upon ritual practices. Each community possessed its own collection of texts, its own traditions about Jesus, its own understanding of salvation. This diversity had been sustainable when Christians remained a small marginalized movement. But as the religion grew, tensions emerged. Different teachers made incompatible claims. Some said Jesus was fully divine but only appeared to be human. Others insisted he was fully human but adopted by God. Some taught that the God of the Hebrew Bible was the one true God who had sent Jesus. Others distinguished between the Creator God of the Old Testament and the Supreme Father revealed by Jesus. Some viewed the material world as good, destined for redemption and resurrection. Others saw matter as inherently evil, destined for destruction, with only spirits being saved. The question of the cross crystallized these tensions. Was the crucifixion primarily a historical event, the torture and execution of Jesus of Nazareth by Roman authorities around 30 CE, or primarily a cosmic symbol revealing eternal truths? Did Jesus truly suffer on the cross, experiencing the full horror of physical torment, or did his divine nature protect him from real suffering? Did the crucifixion accomplish something objective, defeating Satan, paying a debt, satisfying justice, or did it accomplish something subjective, revealing knowledge, providing an example, demonstrating divine love? Leaders emerged who sought to answer these questions in ways that would unify Christian communities. They argued that certain teachings were dangerous distortions of the truth, and that other teachings represented authentic apostolic tradition. These leaders began to develop what would eventually be called orthodoxy, right belief. Irenaeus, Bishop of Lyon in southern France around 180 CE, became the most important early opponent of what he called heresies. Irenaeus had connections to the church in Asia Minor, where he had learned from Polycarp, who claimed to have known the Apostle John personally. This connection to eyewitnesses gave Irenaeus authority when he asserted what the apostles had truly taught. Around 100 CE, Irenaeus completed his massive 5-volume work against heresies, primarily targeting Valentinian Christianity. The full Greek title translates as Detection and Overthrow of What is Falsely Called Knowledge. Irenaeus spent the first volume describing in detail the beliefs and practices of various heretical groups. Historians of religion are deeply grateful for this volume, since it preserves information about groups whose own writings were destroyed. But Irenaeus' purpose was not historical preservation, it was refutation. Irenaeus articulated several principles that would become fundamental to Orthodox Christianity. First, he insisted on the unity of God. There was one God, not 2 or 30 or 365. This one God was both the creator of the material world and the Father of Jesus Christ. Any teaching that distinguished between a creator God and a higher God was false. Second, he insisted on the goodness of creation. The material world, including human flesh, was God's handiwork and was fundamentally good, even if corrupted by sin. Any teaching that viewed matter as evil or as a cosmic mistake was false. Third, he insisted on the reality of the incarnation and crucifixion. Jesus was truly divine and truly human, and he truly suffered and died on the cross. Any teaching that denied the full reality of Jesus' suffering was false. In his attack on Valentinian interpretations of the cross, Irenaeus was particularly forceful. He rejected the idea that the cross was primarily a symbol of cosmic architecture or a revelations of hidden knowledge. For Irenaeus, the cross was first and foremost a historical event with historical consequences. Jesus had died a real death to accomplish a real salvation. His suffering was not symbolic or illusory. It was the means by which God defeated sin and death. Irenaeus argued that the Valentinian system made the crucifixion unnecessary. If salvation came through knowledge, through recognizing one's divine nature, then why did Jesus need to die? The cross became merely a teaching tool, not the instrument of salvation itself. Irenaeus found this unacceptable. He insisted that Jesus' death was essential, not optional. Through his obedient suffering, Jesus had reversed the disobedience of Adam. Through his death, he had destroyed death itself. The physical reality of the crucifixion mattered. Irenaeus also developed the concept of apostolic succession to counter Gnostic claims of secret knowledge. The Valentinians and other Gnostic teachers asserted that Jesus had given secret teachings to select disciples, which had been passed down through chains of initiated students. Irenaeus countered that the apostles had taught publicly, establishing churches and appointing successors. These successors, bishops, had received the authentic teaching and passed it to their successors in an unbroken chain. Any teaching that contradicted what the bishops taught could not be apostolic, even if it claimed to be secret revelation. Tertullian, writing in North Africa around 200 CE, intensified the attack. Tertullian was a brilliant rhetorician with a caustic wit. He coined the phrase, "What has Athens to do with Jerusalem?" predicting the integration of Greek philosophy with Christian faith that characterized much Gnostic teaching. For Tertullian, Christian truth came from revelation, not philosophical speculation. In his prescription against heretics, Tertullian argued that heretics had no right to use Christian scriptures in their arguments. The scriptures belonged to the churches that had received them from the apostles. Anyone teaching doctrines contrary to apostolic tradition was simply misusing texts they had no legitimate claim to. This was a legal argument. Prescription referred to a legal principle that possession over time created ownership. The churches possessed the scriptures and the authentic interpretation. Heretics were usurpers. Tertullian's treatise against Valentinians dripped with sarcasm. He mocked the complexity of Valentinian cosmology, the multiplication of eons, the elaborate mythological narratives. He ridiculed their interpretation of the cross. This heresy of yours does not receive the entire man. It does not work his salvation. For the man has the body, and the body has the cross. For Tertullian, any teaching that diminished the physical reality of Jesus' bodily suffering emptied the cross of its power. These church fathers were not merely engaging in theological debate. They were fighting for the soul of Christianity. From their perspective, teachers like Valentinus threatened to turn Christianity into just another Greek mystery cult, replacing the concrete historical acts of God with abstract philosophical speculations. The cross risked becoming merely a symbol, drained of its historical reality and saving efficacy. But the Gnostic teachers saw matters differently. From their perspective, the proto-Orthodox were limiting God, trapping the infinite within the finite, chaining spirit to matter. By insisting that the material world was created by the supreme God and was fundamentally good, the proto-Orthodox could not adequately explain evil and suffering. By insisting that Jesus was both fully divine and fully human, they created logical paradoxes. By insisting on one correct interpretation of Scripture, they closed off the depths of meaning contained in sacred texts. The conflict was not merely intellectual. Practical considerations were involved. Gnostic teachers claimed direct spiritual authority based on visions and revelations. This undermined the developing hierarchical structure of bishops, presbyters, and deacons. If anyone with the right knowledge could teach, what need was there for ordained clergy? If salvation came through gnosis rather than through participation in church sacraments, what need was there for baptism, Eucharist, or episcopal authority? Additionally, some Gnostic groups practiced Christianity differently. Some rejected material sacraments entirely as unnecessary concessions to the flesh. Others developed alternative sacramental practices, including a bridal chamber ritual, symbolizing the reunion of the soul with its divine counterpart. Some practiced extreme asceticism, rejecting marriage and procreation as collaboration with the demiurge's plan to perpetuate material existence. Others practiced libertinism, arguing that since the body was irrelevant to the spirit, physical actions had no spiritual consequences. The proto-Orthodox found all of this threatening. They wanted Christianity to be recognizable, unified, and morally respectable. They wanted clear boundaries between who was Christian and who was not. They wanted authoritative structures that could maintain order and discipline. The Gnostic emphasis on individual revelation, on secret knowledge, on multiple levels of initiation, on the irrelevance of physical morality, all of this seemed to undermine the very possibility of a unified Christian church. The battle intensified throughout the 2nd and 3rd centuries. Proto-Orthodox leaders wrote more refutations. They developed creeds that explicitly rejected Gnostic teachings. The Apostles' Creed, which emerged in this period, affirmed belief in God the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth, a direct rejection of the Gnostic distinction between the supreme God and the demiurge. It affirmed that Jesus suffered under Pontius Pilate, was crucified, died, and was buried, emphasizing the historical reality of the crucifixion against Gnostic claims that Jesus only appeared to suffer. Christian communities increasingly demanded conformity. those who taught Gnostic doctrines found themselves excluded from fellowship. Texts that expressed Gnostic views were rejected from the emerging New Testament canon. By the end of the 2nd century, most churches accepted the 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, as authoritative, rejecting other Gospels like the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Philip, and the Gospel of Truth. The proto-Orthodox argued that these rejected Gospels were late forgeries, falsely attributed to apostles. The Gnostics argued that these texts preserved authentic secret teachings. The cross became a test of orthodoxy. One's interpretation of the crucifixion revealed one's theology. If you believed Jesus truly suffered as a human being, died a real death, and was resurrected in a transformed physical body, you were orthodox. If you believed Jesus only appeared to suffer, or that his divine nature remained untouched by the crucifixion, or that the resurrection was spiritual rather than physical, you were suspect. The meaning of the cross could not be left open to individual interpretation. It had to be fixed, defined, protected. As Orthodox Christianity consolidated its power and defined its boundaries, Gnostic communities adapted. They could not openly teach what was increasingly condemned as heresy. They could not distribute texts that contradicted the emerging canon, but they could encode their teachings in symbols, pass them secretly among initiates, and hide them from hostile authorities. The cross, being a shared symbol across all forms of Christianity, provided an ideal vehicle for hidden meanings. On the surface, a Gnostic Christian could appear to venerate the cross just as an Orthodox Christian did, but the Gnostic understood the symbol at multiple levels, recognizing meanings invisible to the uninitiated. Archaeological evidence reveals some of these hidden layers. Abraxas gems, produced in large numbers during the 2nd through 4th centuries, provide a window into Gnostic symbolic practice. These engraved stones, usually made from semi-precious materials like jasper or agate, featured complex images combining Greek letters, astrological symbols, Egyptian iconography, and mysterious figures. The term Abraxas itself, according to Basilides, was a name for God containing profound numerical significance. In Greek, each letter has a numerical value. The letters of Abraxas, alpha, beta, rho, alpha, C alpha, sigma, add up to 365, the number of days in the year, and also the number of heavens in Basilidan cosmology. By possessing an Abraxas stone, the bearer claimed protection from the archons who ruled those 365 heavens. Many Abraxas gems featured crosses as central design elements, but these crosses were integrated into complex visual programs that transformed their meaning. Some showed crosses with serpents wrapped around them, the serpent being a symbol of wisdom in Gnostic thought, representing the divine knowledge that liberated humanity from the demiurge. Others showed crosses positioned within circular mandalas divided into sections representing planetary spheres or divine emanations. Still others showed human figures with crosses positioned at key points on the body, suggesting the cross as a key to human spiritual anatomy. The Ophites, serpent Gnostics, developed particularly elaborate diagrams. According to Irenaeus and other heresiologists, the Ophites use visual representations of the cosmos in their rituals. These diagrams, drawn on papyrus or inscribed on stone or metal, showed the path the soul must travel after death to return to the divine realm. The diagrams depicted concentric circles representing the successive heavens, each guarded by an archon with a specific name. At various points crosses appeared, marking gates or thresholds between realms. To ascend through the heavens, the soul had to speak passwords to each archon, proving its right to pass. The Ophite initiate learned these passwords through extended instruction. The passwords often incorporated cross symbolism. I am a child of the Father, who is before all things. I am a stranger and a sojourner. By the sign of the cross I have been sealed. The cross functioned as a kind of passport, a seal that identified the bearer as belonging to the higher realm rather than to the archonic powers. In Gnostic thought, the vertical axis of the cross represented ascent and descent. The supreme God descended vertically into the material world through a series of emanations, each level more distant from the divine source. Jesus descended this same vertical axis, crossing through the archonic spheres, wearing disguises to avoid the archon's notice, until he reached the material world. After his mission, he ascended back through the same spheres, and his followers would follow the same vertical path. The horizontal axis represented limitation, boundary, and temporal existence. The material world extended horizontally, space without spiritual dimension. Archonic power operated horizontally, controlling the plane of matter, but unable to touch the vertical axis that connected to the transcendent realm. To be crucified meant to be stretched between these dimensions, suspended at their intersection. For Orthodox Christians, this suspension meant Jesus' willing embrace of human suffering. For Gnostics, it meant his revelation of the way to transcend horizontal limitation through vertical ascent. Valentinian Christians wore cross pendants that looked conventional to outsiders but held special meaning to initiates. The vertical beam represented the Saviour descending from the pleroma. The horizontal beam represented the boundary or limit established by Stauros. The center point where they intersected was the location of the Incarnation, where Christ entered the material realm. An initiate wearing such a cross would understand it as a personal symbol. I too must cross from matter to spirit, from ignorance to knowledge, from the domain of the demiurge to the pleroma of the Father. Gnostic communities also encoded cross symbolism in their rituals. Baptism was performed with the candidate standing in water arranged in a cross pattern, symbolizing the crossing from the old life to the new. The Eucharist was celebrated with bread marked with crosses that represented not the suffering of Jesus, but the revelation he brought, the bread of knowledge rather than merely the bread of remembrance. Sexual rituals, when practiced, sometimes involve partners lying in cross position, with the vertical representing masculine spirit and the horizontal representing feminine matter, their union producing the androgynous perfect human. These practices were kept secret not merely because they were forbidden, but because Gnostic teachers believed that sacred knowledge should be protected. Pearls should not be cast before swine. The mysteries were dangerous if misunderstood. Only those who had been properly prepared through study and initiation could safely receive the deeper teachings. This secrecy created an atmosphere of exclusivity and elite spirituality that was both attractive to some and suspicious to others. The proto-Orthodox attacked this secrecy, arguing that Jesus had taught openly and that truth had nothing to hide. But the Gnostics responded that Jesus himself had taught in parables, saying to his disciples, "To you has been given the secret of the kingdom of God, but for those outside everything is in parables." The canonical Gospels supported the idea that Jesus gave private teachings to his inner circle, explaining meanings that were hidden from the crowds. As persecution of Gnostic groups intensified, the secret dimension of their teaching became not just a theological principle but a survival strategy. Meetings were held in private homes. Texts were copied in small numbers and shared only among trusted associates. Symbols were used that could have innocent interpretations to outsiders but carried deeper meanings to insiders. The cross, being universally recognized as a Christian symbol, was particularly useful for this dual function. The 3rd century brought crisis to the entire Roman Empire. Beginning in 235 CE, Rome entered a period of chaos that historians call the crisis of the 3rd century. Emperors rose and fell with alarming frequency, often lasting only a year or two before being assassinated or dying in civil war. Germanic tribes pushed across the northern frontiers. The Persian Sassanid Empire attacked from the east. Economic collapse followed military disaster. Plague swept through cities. Trade networks broke down. Coinage was debased, causing inflation. The empire seemed to be disintegrating. In this atmosphere of apocalyptic anxiety, religious movements flourished and clashed. Christianity continued to spread despite intermittent persecutions. Traditional Roman religion experienced revival under emperors who blamed Christian atheism for the gods' abandonment of Rome. Mithraism, the mystery cult of the Persian god Mithras, attracted numerous followers, especially among soldiers. Manichaeism, a new religion founded by the prophet Mani in Persia, spread westward, blending Zoroastrian, Buddhist, and Christian elements into a radical dualistic system. For Gnostic Christians, the crisis confirmed their worldview. The material world ruled by the demiurge was collapsing, proving its fundamentally flawed nature. The chaos demonstrated that the creator of this world was either malevolent or incompetent. Only by turning away from material concerns and seeking gnosis could one find stability and hope. But this very success in making sense of the times also made Gnostic groups vulnerable. As Christianity grew stronger and better organized, orthodox leaders ruled decisively against heretical movements. The 3rd century saw a systematic campaign to suppress alternative forms of Christianity and to establish uniform doctrine and practice. Church councils began to meet more regularly, bringing bishops together to debate disputed questions and reach consensus. These councils established creeds that defined essential beliefs. They developed procedures for dealing with heretics, excommunication, public penance, and when possible, confiscation or destruction of heretical texts. The campaign against Gnostic writings was particularly thorough. Orthodox bishops ordered searches of known Gnostic communities. When texts were discovered, they were seized and burned. The penalty for possessing such texts became increasingly severe. What had begun as theological debate transformed into persecution backed by community pressure and eventually legal force. Several factors contributed to the success of the Orthodox campaign. First, Orthodox Christianity had developed a hierarchical structure with clear lines of authority. Bishops controlled church property, managed finances, distributed charitable aid, and represented their communities to civil authorities. This institutional strength gave orthodoxy staying power that more loosely organized Gnostic groups lacked. Second, Orthodox Christianity proved more attractive to the masses. Its simpler teachings, its emphasis on community, its clear moral guidelines, and its promise of bodily resurrection resonated more broadly than the complex mythologies and intellectual elitism of Gnosticism. Third, Orthodox Christianity made better accommodations with Roman society. Its insistence that the material world was good and that civil authorities served a divine purpose made it less threatening than Gnostic rejection of worldly powers as archonic deceptions. By the late 3rd century, Gnostic schools that had flourished in major cities for more than a century were disappearing. Teachers found it increasingly difficult to attract students. Communities fragmented. Texts became scarce as copies were burned, and no new copies were made to replace them. In Egypt, where Gnostic Christianity had been particularly strong, the situation became desperate. When the Roman Empire began persecuting Christians more systematically in the early 4th century, both Orthodox and Gnostic Christians suffered. But when Constantine legalized Christianity in 313 CE, it was Orthodox Christianity that received imperial favor. The church that Constantine supported, and that his successors would make the official religion of the empire, was the church of the councils and creeds, not the church of secret gospels and hidden knowledge. The Edict of Milan in 313 CE granted Christians freedom of worship, ending centuries of intermittent persecution. But this freedom came with strings attached. The empire supported one form of Christianity, the form that Constantine and his bishops defined as correct. Alternative forms of Christianity did not receive this support and often faced active suppression. In 325 CE, Constantine convened the Council of Nicaea, bringing together hundreds of bishops to resolve disputes about the nature of Christ. The council produced the Nicene Creed, which affirmed that Jesus was true God from true God, begotten, not made, of one substance with the Father. This formulation excluded both Gnostic views that distinguished between Christ and Jesus, and Arian views that made Christ a created being subordinate to the Father. The decades following Nicaea saw intensifying efforts to suppress heresy. Bishops who had been merely advisors now had imperial backing. Imperial laws began to criminalize heretical teaching. Books were not just burned voluntarily, they were confiscated by force of law. Heretics were not just excommunicated, they were exiled, imprisoned, or executed. For Gnostic communities, this spelled doom. They had survived persecution when all Christians were persecuted together. They could not survive when the empire supported their opponents. Some Gnostic Christians recanted, accepting Orthodox teaching to avoid punishment. Others went underground, practicing their faith in secret. Still others fled to the margins of the empire, to regions where imperial control was weak. In Upper Egypt, far from Alexandria and the centres of imperial power, some Gnostic communities held on. Monasteries in the desert provided refuge for those fleeing persecution. But even here, the pressure mounted. Orthodox monks viewed Gnostic teachings as demonic deceptions. Desert fathers preached against the heretics in their midst. Around 3 CE, Athanasius, the powerful bishop of Alexandria, sent his annual Easter letter to the churches under his authority. In this letter, he defined which books were to be read in churches and which were to be rejected. He listed the 27 books that would become the New Testament canon. Any other books, he declared, were heretical and should be destroyed. This letter had profound consequences. Monasteries throughout Egypt received Athanasius's instructions. Libraries were purged. Manuscripts were burned. It was probably in response to this decree that a monk or group of monks in Upper Egypt made a fateful decision. Rather than destroy their collection of Gnostic texts, they would hide them. The monks took their books, 13 leather-bound codices containing over 50 texts, and sealed them in a large ceramic jar. They carried the jar into the desert to the base of the Jabal al-Tarif cliffs near the town of Nag Hammadi. There they buried it, perhaps hoping to retrieve it later when the persecution subsided, perhaps knowing they would never see it again, but wanting to preserve these texts for some unknown future. The jar was buried around 370 CE. For more than the 500 years, it would remain hidden beneath the sand, preserving a library of forbidden knowledge, a time capsule containing the voices of suppressed teachers and their distinctive interpretation of the cross. From the late 4th century through the mid-20th century, Gnostic Christianity existed primarily as a heresy described by its opponents. The writings of the Gnostics themselves, their Gospels, their tractates, their poems and prayers, were almost entirely lost. What later generations knew about Gnosticism came filtered through the hostile accounts of heresiologists like Irenaeus, Hippolytus, and Epiphanius. This created a distorted picture. The Church Fathers quoted Gnostic texts selectively, usually choosing passages that seemed most absurd or offensive. They described Gnostic practices in sensational terms, emphasizing accusations of sexual immorality and ritual perversion. They attributed evil motives to Gnostic teachers, portraying them as deceived by demons or motivated by pride. Reading these accounts, one might conclude that Gnosticism was simply a collection of bizarre heresies with no redeeming intellectual or spiritual value. Yet even through these hostile accounts, something compelling emerged. The quotations, though selected to demonstrate error, revealed sophisticated theological reasoning. The descriptions of Gnostic cosmology, though meant to seem ridiculous, displayed remarkable imaginative power. The accounts of Gnostic practice, though intended to scandalize, suggested communities devoted to spiritual transformation. Something significant had been lost, though its exact nature remained obscured. Medieval Christianity had little direct contact with Gnostic texts. The Church possessed virtually complete intellectual authority in Western Europe. Monasteries preserved manuscripts, but they preserved what Church authorities considered orthodox. Heretical texts, when discovered, were destroyed. The official narrative of Christian history became the only narrative. The winners had not only won, they had erased evidence that there had ever been a contest. Byzantine Christianity maintained some memory of Gnosticism through the works of heresiologists, which were copied and studied. But these texts served primarily as warnings against contemporary heresies. The specific historical movements called Gnostic had vanished so completely that they seemed like ancient curiosities, threats that had been successfully neutralized. Islamic scholars, who had access to some materials that did not survive in Christian hands, preserved a few texts. The Sabians of Harran, a religious community in Syria, may have maintained Gnostic traditions into the Islamic period. Arab philosophers who translated Greek texts sometimes encountered Hermetic writings that shared affinities with Gnosticism, but these materials remained marginal, unknown to most Western scholars. The Renaissance brought renewed interest in ancient texts and forgotten traditions. Humanist scholars sought out Greek and Latin manuscripts in monastery libraries and Byzantine collections. In 1463, the Hermetic Corpus, a collection of texts attributed to Hermes Trismegistus, was brought to Florence. Marsilio Ficino translated it into Latin, and it became enormously influential. Educated Europeans discovered a supposedly ancient Egyptian wisdom that seemed to anticipate Christianity while incorporating Platonic philosophy. Though scholars would later determine that the Hermetic texts were composed in the 2nd century CE rather than in ancient Egypt, their recovery demonstrated that alternative spiritualities had existed in the early Christian centuries. The Reformation shattered Christian unity and, paradoxically, created new interest in early Christian diversity. Protestant reformers accused the Catholic Church of having corrupted true Christianity, adding doctrines and practices not found in Scripture or the early Church. Catholic scholars responded by defending church tradition and demonstrating continuity with the early Church Fathers. Both sides studied the history of Christian doctrine more carefully than had been done in centuries. As this historical research progressed, some scholars began to recognize that early Christianity had been more diverse than previously acknowledged. The Church Fathers themselves testified to this diversity through their anti-heretical writings. Questions arose: had the Church Fathers been entirely fair in their descriptions? Had valuable insights been lost along with the heresies? What had the heretics actually taught in their own words? By the 19th century, European imperialism brought Western scholars into contact with Middle Eastern and Egyptian antiquities. Archaeological excavations in Egypt produced spectacular discoveries. Pharaonic tombs, ancient temples, hieroglyphic inscriptions, everything Egyptian became fashionable. Museums competed to acquire mummies, statues, and papyri. Egyptology emerged as a scholarly discipline. Among the discoveries were papyrus manuscripts, many from the Roman period. Most were mundane, tax records, letters, literary texts already known from medieval manuscripts. But occasionally exciting finds emerged. In 1851, an unprovenanced Coptic manuscript was purchased that contained what seemed to be a Gnostic text, the Pistis Sophia, a complex dialogue between Jesus and his disciples. In 1896, the Berlin Codex was purchased, containing several texts including the Gospel of Mary, the Apocryphon of John, and the Sophia of Jesus Christ. These manuscripts provided the first direct access to Gnostic texts in more than 1,500 years. Scholars were surprised by what they found. The texts were more coherent and sophisticated than heresiological accounts had suggested. They were also more diverse, representing different Gnostic schools with distinct theologies. The Gospel of Mary presented Mary Magdalene as a privileged recipient of revelation, challenging early Christianity's marginalization of women. The Apocryphon of John recounted an elaborate cosmogony involving multiple divine emanations and the creation of the material world by ignorant powers. But these few texts, though valuable, left many questions unanswered. Scholars could not fully reconstruct Gnostic Christianity from such limited sources. The quotations in heresiological works remained essential for understanding most Gnostic groups. It was like trying to reconstruct a symphony from a few measures of music and hostile reviews. The cross in these recovered texts appeared with meanings that both paralleled and diverged from orthodox interpretation. The Pistis Sophia described Christ's crucifixion, but emphasized his triumphant ascent through the archonic spheres, binding each power and removing its authority. The Berlin text mentioned the cross primarily as a symbol of division and reunification, separation and return. But without more text, the full range of Gnostic cross symbolism remained elusive. Through all these centuries, the jar buried near Nag Hammadi remained undisturbed. Desert wind piled sand over it. Bedouins passed nearby. Archaeologists explored other sites. The world changed dramatically. Empires rose and fell, religions spread and transformed. Technology revolutionized human life. But the jar and its contents waited in darkness, preserving voices from the 2nd and 3rd centuries, voices that had been systematically silenced but never entirely extinguished. December 1945. Muhammad Ali al-Saman and his brothers were digging for sabak, nitrogen-rich fertilizer, near the Jabal al-Tarif cliffs in Upper Egypt. This region, near the town of Nag Hammadi, was agricultural land, poor and remote. The farmers supplemented their income by digging sabak from ancient settlements and selling it to enrich modern fields. Muhammad Ali struck something with his mattock. Not the soft earth he expected, but something hard. Clearing away the sand, he uncovered a large sealed jar nearly a metre tall. The jar was made of red earthenware, its mouth covered with a bowl-shaped lid sealed with bitumen. Muhammad Ali later said he hesitated before breaking the jar open. Peasant folklore in Egypt held that jinn, spirits, were often sealed in jars. If he broke the seal, might he release something dangerous? But there was also the possibility of gold. Ancient jars sometimes contained treasure. Greed overcame fear. He smashed the jar with his mattock. No jinn emerged. No gold glittered in the sunlight. Instead, the jar contained books, 13 leather-bound volumes, their pages brown with age. Muhammad Ali and his brothers were illiterate. They could not read the books and did not immediately recognize their significance. But books might be valuable. They gathered up the volumes, loaded them on their camel, and brought them home. At home, Muhammad Ali's mother was making bread in a traditional oven fueled by straw and dried palm leaves. Muhammad Ali, unsure what else to do with the books and needing kindling, tossed some of the loose pages into the oven to feed the fire. Several texts were destroyed this way, their words turning to ash before anyone could read them. But before all the books could be burned for fuel, events intervened. Muhammad Ali became involved in a blood feud. His father had been murdered months earlier, and the family learned the identity of the killer. In revenge, Muhammad Ali and his brothers murdered the man and, in a ritual act, consumed his heart. Now they were being hunted by both the victim's family and the police. In this dangerous situation, Muhammad Ali needed to hide assets that might be confiscated. He gave one of the codices to a local priest, asking him to keep it safe. The priest showed the book to his brother-in-law, Raghib Andrawus, a history teacher in the nearby town. Raghib immediately recognized that this was no ordinary book. The script was Coptic, the final stage of the ancient Egyptian language. The contents appeared to be early Christian texts. Raghib brought the codex to Cairo and showed it to a Coptic physician and amateur antiquities dealer. Word spread among dealers and collectors. Eventually, pages from the codex reached the Coptic Museum in Cairo. Jean Dorès, a French scholar of Coptic Christianity, examined them in October 1946 and immediately recognized their extraordinary significance. These were Gnostic texts, not quotations in heresiological works, but complete documents from Gnostic communities themselves. The codices entered a complicated legal and political situation. Egypt had laws against unauthorized excavation and export of antiquities, but these laws were often ignored. Dealers smuggled artifacts out of the country to sell to wealthy European and American collectors. The Egyptian government was in transition. King Farouk's corrupt regime was losing legitimacy, and nationalist forces were gaining strength. In 1952, Gamal Abdel Nasser would lead a revolution that would transform Egypt. Dorés worked to prevent the codices from being sold off page by page to private collectors, which would have scattered and perhaps destroyed them. He contacted his colleague Togo Mina at the Coptic Museum, who began negotiating to acquire the codices for Egypt, but the process was slow. Some codices remained in the hands of private individuals. One was smuggled out of Egypt and eventually purchased by the Jung Institute in Zurich, where it became known as the Jung Codex. Meanwhile, the Egyptian government officially seized the codices that remained in Egypt, depositing them at the Coptic Museum. But even there, they were not secure. Political upheaval, bureaucratic obstacles, and scholarly rivalries delayed proper conservation and publication. The manuscripts deteriorated as they sat in storage. Pages crumbled, fragments were lost. Slowly, painstakingly, scholars began the work of conservation, photography, and translation. The codices were in fragile condition. Many pages were damaged, torn, stained with text illegible or missing. The books had not been kept together as a set after their discovery, so scholars had to track down where each volume had ended up. Some pages had been sold individually and were in private collections or museums around the world. The physical form of the codices themselves was significant. These were not scrolls, which had been the standard format for books in the ancient world. They were codices, books with pages bound on one side, like modern books. This format had been pioneered by early Christians and gave them advantages over scrolls: easier to reference specific passages, more compact, possible to write on both sides of each page. The Nag Hammadi codices were among the oldest surviving examples of the codex format, providing important evidence for the history of the book as technology. The covers were made of leather, with intricate tooling and decorative patterns. Inside some covers, fragments of papyrus had been used as padding or stiffening, like cartonnage. These papyrus fragments included mundane documents, letters, receipts, contracts that could be dated. Analysis suggested the codices had been manufactured in the mid-4th century, probably between 350 and 380 CE. This dating fit perfectly with the hypothesis that they had been hidden in response to Athanasius's 367 CE decree against heretical books. The contents were more diverse than initially expected. The 13 codices contained 52 texts, though some appeared in multiple copies. Most were previously unknown. They included Gospels attributed to Thomas, Philip, and the Egyptians. They included secret books, apocryphons, attributed to John and James. They included apocalypses, tractates, prayers, and philosophical discourses. Not all were Gnostic in the strict sense. The collection included excerpts from Plato's Republic and the Sentences of Sextus, a collection of pagan philosophical maxims. The library revealed a learned community interested in diverse perspectives on wisdom and salvation. These were not ignorant cultists, but serious students of religion and philosophy. They valued texts from different traditions and saw wisdom in multiple sources. The presence of non-Christian texts alongside Christian ones suggested a cosmopolitan, syncretic approach to spirituality. As translations became available, the text generated enormous excitement. The Gospel of Thomas, a collection of sayings attributed to Jesus, challenged assumptions about gospel composition and suggested that very early forms of Christianity focused on Jesus as wisdom teacher rather than sacrificial saviour. The Gospel of Philip contained cryptic aphorisms about sacraments and spiritual marriage. The Apocryphon of John presented an elaborate Gnostic cosmogony. The Gospel of Truth, possibly by Valentinus himself, offered poetic meditations on knowledge and ignorance, light and darkness. The scholar who would do most to bring the Nag Hammadi texts to public attention was not a Coptic specialist or a theologian, but a historian of religion with a gift for accessible writing. Elaine Pagels, an American scholar who had studied the manuscripts as part of her doctoral research, published the Gnostic Gospels in 1979. The book became a surprise bestseller, introducing general readers to texts that had been known only to specialists. Pagels argued that the Gnostic texts revealed a lost Christianity, one more diverse and in some ways more attractive than Orthodox Christianity. She emphasized themes that resonated with late 20th century American readers: individual spiritual authority rather than hierarchical control, mystical experience rather than doctrinal conformity, equality between men and women rather than patriarchal structure, questioning rather than blind faith. The Gnostic Gospels was published during a period of significant cultural change in the United States. The 1960s and 1970s had seen widespread questioning of traditional authorities, including religious authorities. Alternative spiritualities, Eastern religions, New Age movements, mysticism attracted many who found conventional Christianity unsatisfying. The women's movement challenged male dominance in religious institutions. Scholars in religious studies were developing new methods that studied religion as a human phenomenon rather than from within a faith tradition. Into this context came texts that seemed to legitimize contemporary concerns by grounding them in ancient Christianity. Here was a Gospel of Thomas that presented Jesus teaching gnosis, knowledge of the divine within, rather than salvation through his death. Here was a Gospel of Philip that spoke of the divine feminine. Here was a Gospel of Mary that presented Mary Magdalene as the disciple with the deepest understanding, superior even to Peter. Pagels and other scholars emphasized that these texts showed early Christian diversity. Before orthodoxy won, multiple forms of Christianity competed. The versions that survived as orthodoxist were not necessarily more authentic or more faithful to Jesus' teaching. They were simply the versions backed by bishops who gained institutional power and eventually imperial support. The suppressed versions might have insights worth recovering. The cross appeared throughout the Nag Hammadi texts, but its meaning varied dramatically from text to text. The second treatise of the Great Seth, attributed to the divine Seth communicating through Jesus, presented a radically different crucifixion narrative. In this text, Jesus speaks in the first person, describing his crucifixion. "I did not die in reality, but in appearance, lest I be put to shame by them. I was not afflicted at all. Those who were there punished me, and I did not die in fact, but in appearance. It was another, their father, who drank the gall and the vinegar. It was not I. They struck me with the reed. It was another Simon who bore the cross on his shoulder. It was another upon whom they placed the crown of thorns. But I was rejoicing in the height over all the wealth of the archons and the offspring of their error, of their empty glory, and I was laughing at their ignorance." This passage shocked many readers. Jesus laughing at his crucifixion seemed grotesque, sacrilegious. But from a Gnostic perspective, it made perfect sense. Jesus was not truly suffering because the material body being tortured was not his true self. His divine consciousness stood apart, observing the cosmic comedy of archons who thought they were executing God. The crucifixion revealed the ignorance of worldly powers, their inability to touch what is truly real. Other texts elaborated on this theme. The Apocalypse of Peter recounted a vision in which Peter sees two figures during the crucifixion, one being nailed to the cross, and another, the living Jesus, standing nearby, glad and laughing. When Peter asks for an explanation, Jesus explains, "He whom you saw on the tree, glad and laughing, this is the living Jesus. But this one into whose hands and feet they drive the nails is his fleshly part, which is the substitute being put to shame, the one who came into being in his likeness." The physical body on the cross is merely a shell. The true Jesus remains untouched. These passages articulated what scholars call doketism, from the Greek word dokein, meaning to seem or to appear. Jesus only seemed to be human, only appeared to suffer. His physical body was either illusory or a temporary garment that the divine Christ wore and discarded. This view, condemned as heresy by Orthodox Christianity, preserved divine transcendence by ensuring that God never truly experienced material suffering. But not all Gnostic texts were equally docetic. The Gospel of Truth, while emphasizing Jesus' role as revealer of knowledge, also described his passion in moving terms. Jesus was patient in accepting sufferings, since he knows that his death is life for many. This text did not deny the reality of Jesus' death, but reinterpreted its meaning. The death was not a payment for sin, but an act of revelation, showing that material death is not real death. Those who possess gnosis realize that their true self cannot be killed. The cross as cosmic symbol appeared most clearly in Valentinian texts. The tripartite tractate described the cross as the place where the Saviour made the distinction between those who are perfect and those who are not perfect. It was the boundary marker, the limit that separated the pleroma from the realm of deficiency. To be crucified with Christ meant to reach that boundary and cross it, leaving behind material limitation. The interpretation of knowledge, another Valentinian text, presented the cross as the instrument of unity, for the cross is the unity of the all. It explained that through the cross, scattered elements would be gathered together. The vertical beam represented ascent toward the Father. The horizontal beam represented the extension of salvation to all who would receive it. The entire structure formed a symbol of cosmic reintegration, where what had been divided would be made whole. Some texts presented the cross as having existed before creation. In the Sophia of Jesus Christ, Christ explains cosmology to his disciples. Before anything was visible of those things that are visible, the majesty and the authority were in the cross, since it is immeasurable, incomprehensible. The cross was not merely a historical instrument of execution, but an eternal structure, the form of divine order that predated and would outlast the material world. Gilles Quispel, a Dutch scholar who had been instrumental in acquiring the Young Codex, spent decades analysing these texts. He argued that Gnosticism should be understood not as deviant Christianity, but as an independent religious movement that predated Christianity and then intersected with it. The Gnostic myth of the divine spark trapped in matter, of the demiurge and archons, of salvation through knowledge. All of this existed before Stos, Quispel suggested, in heterodox Jewish speculation and Eastern religious influence. When Gnostics encountered Christianity, they interpreted it through their existing frameworks. Hans Jonas, a German philosopher and historian of religion, offered an existentialist reading of Gnosticism. Writing in the mid-20th century, Jonas saw parallels between Gnostic alienation from the material world and modern existential anxiety. The Gnostics' experience of being thrown into an alien world, trapped in matter, cut off from the divine source, mirrored the modern person's experience of absurdity and meaninglessness. The call to awaken, to recognize one's true identity, resonated with existentialist emphasis on authentic existence. Jonas argued that Gnosticism was the first articulation of themes that would only fully emerge in modern philosophy. These scholarly debates sometimes lost sight of the religious experience underlying the texts. The Nag Hammadi Library was not an academic collection, but a spiritual one, assembled by people for whom these texts offered transformation, hope, and meaning. When a 4th century Egyptian Christian read about the cosmic cross, they were not engaging in abstract theology, but seeking a path through suffering to transcendence. When they read about Jesus laughing at his crucifixion, they were learning to maintain spiritual joy despite persecution. When they studied diagrams of the pleroma and meditated on the cross as the axis between worlds, they were practicing a discipline aimed at liberating consciousness from material limitation. The Gnostic reinterpretation of the crucifixion challenges fundamental assumptions about the relationship between divinity and suffering. For Orthodox Christianity, the cross demonstrates that God fully entered into human experience, including its most painful dimensions. The suffering of Jesus was real, complete, and redemptive. Through his willingness to endure the cross, he transformed suffering itself, making it no longer merely tragic but potentially meaningful. Gnosticism rejected this equation. From a Gnostic perspective, the divine could not truly suffer. To suggest otherwise was to limit God, to bring the infinite down to the level of the finite. The supreme God, being pure spirit, pure light, utterly transcendent, could not be affected by material events. To nail God to a cross was a logical impossibility, like trying to capture light in a box or imprison the wind. But if God could not suffer, what was happening at Golgotha? The Gnostic answer involved layers of illusion and substitution. The physical body on the cross was not God. It was at most a temporary vehicle, a material shell that the divine Christ had worn for a time, but was not essentially connected to. When that body died, the divine Christ remained untouched. Some Gnostic texts suggested that Jesus had never truly taken on flesh at all. His body was an appearance, a phantom, a simulacrum. He walked among humans in a form they could perceive, but this form was not genuinely material. He ate and drank not because his body required nourishment, but to avoid revealing his nature. When he was crucified, nails passed through illusory flesh, and illusory blood was shed. The whole spectacle was staged for the benefit of ignorant powers who needed to believe they had defeated him. Other texts suggested a different mechanism: substitution. A common motif involved Simon of Cyrene, the man who, according to the canonical Gospels, was forced to carry Jesus' cross. In Gnostic retellings, Simon did more than carry the cross. He took Jesus' place on it. Through divine magic, Simon was made to appear as Jesus, while Jesus either took on Simon's appearance and watched from the crowd, or became invisible, or ascended directly to the spiritual realm. The Basilidean account emphasized this. The archons, in their ignorance, crucified the wrong man, while Jesus laughed at their mistake. A third version involved a more complex dualism. Jesus had two aspects: the divine Christ, which was pure spirit, and the human Jesus, which was matter. These two were temporarily joined during Jesus' ministry, but separated before the crucifixion. The human Jesus suffered and died on the cross, but the divine Christ departed beforehand, ascending back to the pleroma. What was crucified was only the human shell, which the archons could touch, not the divine essence, which remained forever beyond their reach. Each of these versions addressed the same theological problem: how to maintain divine transcendence while accounting for the crucifixion narrative central to Christian tradition. They were not trying to deny that a crucifixion had occurred, but to clarify what it meant, and they all agreed that whatever happened on that cross, it did not involve the true suffering of God. This position created profound conflict with emerging orthodoxy. For orthodox teachers, the claim that Jesus did not truly suffer was the worst heresy. It undermined the entire logic of salvation. If Jesus did not truly take on human nature, including human suffering, then he did not truly redeem human nature. If God did not descend into the depths of human pain, then those depths remained unredeemed. The cross was meaningless unless the one who hung there was genuinely divine and genuinely suffered. Irenaeus made this argument forcefully. He insisted on the principle he called recapitulation. Jesus recapitulated, went through again, the entire human experience from birth to death. By doing so, he sanctified every stage of human life and reversed the trajectory of sin and death inaugurated by Adam. This required that Jesus be truly human, experiencing human limitations, temptations, suffering, and death. Any teaching that reduced Jesus' humanity to mere appearance destroyed the possibility of salvation. The Gospel of Peter, discovered in the late 19th century, contained an intriguing passage that might reflect Gnostic influence. When describing the crucifixion, it said, "And they brought two malefactors and crucified the Lord in the midst of them. But he held his peace, as if he felt no pain." This as if opened space for docetic interpretation. Perhaps he felt no pain because his divine nature insulated him from suffering, or because the material body being tortured was not his true self. The canonical Gospel of John also contained elements that Gnostics could interpret docetically. John's Jesus seemed remarkably in control throughout his passion. He did not pray in agony in Gethsemane. He did not cry out in despair from the cross. His final words, "It is finished," sound like a statement of accomplished mission rather than anguished defeat. John's Gospel emphasized Jesus' divinity so strongly that some Orthodox Christians worried it veered too close to Docetism. Yet the Church included it in the canon Trusting that passages affirming Jesus' humanity, the Word became flesh, adequately balanced the divine emphasis, the Gnostic texts pressed further. They made explicit what John only hinted at, that the crucifixion was primarily a revelation rather than a sacrifice. It revealed the ignorance of the archons who thought they could kill God. It revealed the illusory nature of material suffering. It revealed the path of ascent through renunciation of attachment to the body. The cross was a teaching tool, and the teaching was, matter cannot touch spirit, death cannot touch life, ignorance cannot extinguish knowledge. This teaching resonated with certain streams of Greek philosophy. Platonic and Stoic thinkers had long taught that the wise person becomes indifferent to external circumstances. The body might be tortured, but the soul remains free. Material pleasure and pain are equally irrelevant to the truly philosophical life. The person who achieves wisdom, Sophia, transcends suffering by recognizing its unreality relative to eternal truth. Gnostic Christians applied this philosophical insight to the cross. Jesus on the cross modeled perfect Gnostic wisdom. While his body experienced the mechanical processes of crucifixion, his consciousness remained in the spiritual realm, unaffected, even joyful. He laughed not because he was cruel, but because he had completely transcended the domain where crucifixion had power. His laughter was the laughter of liberation, the joy of one who knows that I am not this body, I am not this suffering, I am not these limitations. Critics saw this as a failure of compassion. A Jesus who did not truly suffer could not truly empathize with human suffering. A God who remained untouched by pain while watching humans endure agony seemed cold, distant, even cruel. Orthodox Christianity insisted that God's love was demonstrated precisely through God's willingness to suffer with and for humanity. The incarnation meant that God had irrevocably joined the divine nature to human nature, including human vulnerability. But Gnostics might have replied that Orthodox Christianity had it backward. By insisting that God must suffer, orthodoxy was actually limiting God, dragging divinity down into the muck of matter. True divine love meant showing humans the way out of suffering, not joining them in it. Christ's mission was not to suffer, but to reveal that suffering is unreal, that the true self cannot suffer, that liberation is possible. His laughter on the cross was not mockery, but invitation. You too can transcend this. You too can recognize your true nature. You too can be free. Beyond the question of whether Jesus truly suffered, Gnostic texts developed elaborate interpretations of the cross as a structure revealing cosmic architecture. They saw in its geometry a diagram of reality itself, a map of the spiritual journey from ignorance to enlightenment. The vertical beam represented the axis mundi, the world axis, connecting heaven and earth, spirit and matter, the transcendent realm and the material realm. This vertical axis was the path of divine emanation descending from the supreme God through successive levels until reaching the material world. It was also the path of return the route awakened souls would travel in, their ascent back to the divine source. Ancient cosmology imagined a vertical universe. Heaven was literally above, earth in the middle, and Hades or the underworld below. The vertical axis of the cross mapped onto this three-tiered cosmos. But Gnostic cosmology was more complex, featuring not 3 but 7, 8 or more levels. Between the supreme God and the material world lay the planetary spheres: Moon, Mercury, Venus, Sun, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, each ruled by an archon. Beyond the planets lay the sphere of fixed stars, the Ogdoad, and ultimately the Pleroma itself. The soul's journey after death involved ascending through these spheres. At each level, the soul encountered an archon who demanded payment or passwords. The soul had to shed the material accretions accumulated during earthly life, leaving behind at each sphere the aspect of personality connected to that planetary influence. Only when all material elements were discarded could the pure divine spark return to the Pleroma. The vertical beam of the cross represented this journey. To be crucified meant to be stretched along this axis, suspended between matter and spirit. Christ's crucifixion demonstrated the possibility of traversing this axis. His ascent after the crucifixion involved passing through each archonic sphere, stripping away the material body, revealing his true divine nature, and finally returning to the Father. His disciples would follow the same path. The horizontal beam represented different dimensions. Some interpreters saw it as representing time, the extension of earthly existence across past, present, and future. To be attached to the horizontal beam meant to be trapped in temporal existence, unable to rise to the eternal realm represented by the vertical axis. Others saw the horizontal as representing the multiplicity of material manifestations, the many versus the one, diversity versus unity. The horizontal scattered what the vertical gathered. In Valentinian theology, the horizontal beam specifically represented the limit or boundary established by Stauros. It was the demarcation between the pleroma and everything outside it. This boundary prevented the chaos and deficiency outside from contaminating the divine realm, while also preventing aeons from wandering outside the pleroma into non-being. The boundary was protective but also tragic. It meant that those on the outside, including trapped divine sparks, were cut off from their true home. The center point where vertical and horizontal intersect became the most charged location. This was the point of transformation, where opposites meet, where crossing becomes possible. In alchemical language, it was the philosopher's stone, the point where base matter transformed into spiritual gold. In mystical language, it was the still point of the turning world, the place of perfect balance and infinite potential. Christ at the center of the cross occupied this transformative position. He was the mediator not in the sense of negotiating between two parties, but in the geometric sense of being the middle term, the point of connection. Through him, the vertical axis touched the horizontal plane. Through him, spirit reached into matter, and a matter gained access to spirit. The incarnation itself was this crossing, the divine Christ crossing from the pleroma into the material world. The crucifixion was the reverse crossing, the return journey, the ascent back to the source. Valentinian cosmograms, diagrams of the divine structure, illustrated these concepts visually. Though no second-century examples survive, descriptions from heresiologists and later Gnostic diagrams suggest their appearance. Concentric circles represented the pleroma and its eons, arranged in male-female pairs. Lines radiating from a central point represented emanation from the supreme source. A cross inscribed over the circles indicated the vertical axis of emanation and ascent, and the horizontal boundary between pleroma and deficiency. Meditating on these diagrams was a spiritual practice. By focusing on the geometric structure, the initiate could internalize the cosmic architecture and recognize the same pattern within their own being. The vertical axis existed not only in the cosmos but in the human body, the spine connecting the base to the crown, the channel through which spiritual energy ascended. The horizontal axis existed in the extension of the arms, the reach into the material world. Every human being was a cross, suspended between dimensions. Elaine Pagels noted that this mystical interpretation of the cross differed fundamentally from Orthodox understanding. Orthodox Christianity emphasized the cross as a one-time historical event. Jesus died circa 30 CE on a cross outside Jerusalem, and this death accomplished salvation. The cross was past tense, accomplished, finished. Believers remembered it through the Eucharist and venerated it through the sign of the cross, but they did not need to repeat it. Gnostic Christianity emphasized the cross as an ongoing reality and task. Every soul must be crucified, must undergo the death of identification with matter and the resurrection of recognition of spiritual identity. The physical cross on Golgotha served as an instance, a demonstration, a teaching model. But the real crucifixion was internal and eternal, the continuous process of detaching from material illusion and ascending toward the real. This understanding connected Gnostic cross symbolism to broader patterns in mystical religion. Mircea Eliade, the historian of religion, identified the axis mundi as a universal religious symbol. Sacred mountains, trees, pillars, and temples all functioned as connections between heaven and earth. The shaman climbed the world tree to reach the spirit realm. Jacob saw a ladder with angels ascending and descending. Buddhist stupas represented Mount Meru, the cosmic mountain at the center of the universe. Medieval cathedrals were built as vertical aspirations, their spires pointing heavenward. The cross participated in this archetype. His vertical beam was another version of the world tree, the axis connecting realms. But the addition of the horizontal beam created something more. Not just a ladder, but a place of tension. Not just connection, but conflict. The cross acknowledged that ascending vertically requires rejecting the horizontal pull of matter, time, and multiplicity. Spiritual progress involves sacrifice, cutting away attachments, leaving behind the world, dying to the old self. After the 4th century, when Gnostic schools were suppressed and texts destroyed, Gnostic ideas did not entirely disappear. They survived in fragments, in underground streams, in mystical movements that emerged at the margins of orthodoxy. The cosmic cross, with its multiple layers of meaning, appeared again and again throughout subsequent centuries, sometimes recognized as Gnostic, sometimes not. Manichaeism, founded by the prophet Mani in 3rd century Persia, incorporated Gnostic elements into a distinct religious system. Mani explicitly drew on Christianity, Zoroastrianism, and Buddhism, creating what he called the final revelation that synthesized all previous religions. Manichaean cosmology featured radical dualism, light versus darkness, spirit versus matter, and taught that particles of light were trapped in matter, awaiting liberation. Though Mani rejected the historicity of Jesus' crucifixion, calling it a deception, he used the cross as a symbol of the cross of light, representing the suffering light particles crucified in matter. Manichaeism spread rapidly across the ancient world from North Africa to China. For a time, it seemed positioned to become a world religion, but it faced persecution from both Christian and Zoroastrian authorities. Christian emperors issued edicts against Manichaeans, confiscating property, exiling practitioners, sometimes executing leaders. The religion survived longest in Central Asia, where Manichaean texts were discovered in the 20th century in Chinese Turkestan. In medieval Europe, dualistic heresies repeatedly emerged. The Bogomils in Bulgaria and the Cathars in southern France taught doctrines remarkably similar to ancient Gnosticism. The material world was created by an evil demiurge, the soul was trapped in matter, and salvation required gnosis. The Cathars called themselves good Christians and claimed to represent the true apostolic faith. They rejected the cross as a symbol, calling it an instrument of torture unworthy of veneration. Yet even in rejecting the physical cross, the Cathars retained the spiritual concept. They spoke of the cross of light, invisible to material eyes but present in spiritual reality. This cross was not wood but truth itself, the revelation that liberated souls from material bondage. Catha Perfecti, the elect who had received the Consolamentum sacrament, were said to bear this cross internally, sacrificing all attachment to the material world. The Catholic Church responded to the Cathar movement with the Albigensian Crusade and the establishment of the Inquisition. The Crusade, lasting from 1209 to 1229, devastated southern France, killing thousands and destroying the centres of Cathar culture. The Inquisition systematically hunted remaining Cathars, using torture to extract confessions and burning unrepentant heretics. By the early 14th century, organised Catharism was extinct. Inquisition records preserve testimony from Cathar believers, providing insight into their beliefs. When accused of denying the cross, Cathars explained that they did not deny Christ's sacrifice but rejected worship of the physical instrument of execution. They described the true cross as spiritual, as the intersection of divine wisdom and human receptivity, as the structure supporting the ascent from ignorance to knowledge. Christian mysticism, even in its orthodox form, sometimes approached Gnostic ideas. Meister Eckhart, a 14th century German Dominican, preached sermons that emphasized the divine spark within the soul, the need to detach from created things, and the possibility of union with God through mystical gnosis. Eckhart was accused of heresy, and some of his propositions were condemned after his death. Yet his writings influenced generations of mystics and demonstrate that Gnostic themes could emerge even within the structure of Catholic religious orders. Jakob Böhme, a 17th century German shoemaker and visionary, developed a complex mystical cosmology involving the unfolding of God through contraries. Böhme spoke of the cross as the place where contraries meet and are reconciled. He described creation as God's self-crucifixion, the divine splitting itself into subject and object, light and darkness, in order to know itself. His writings influenced Romanticism, German idealism, and esoteric Christianity. The Rosicrucian movement, emerging in early 17th century Germany, combined alchemy, mysticism, and esoteric Christianity. Rosicrucian manifestos spoke of a hidden brotherhood possessing ancient wisdom. Their symbolism featured roses and crosses combined, the rose blooming at the centre of the cross, representing the flowering of spiritual consciousness at the point where dimensions intersect. Whether or not an actual Rosicrucian organization existed, the symbolism expressed ideas compatible with Gnostic interpretations of the cross. Freemasonry, developing in the 17th and 18th centuries, incorporated complex symbolism including crosses, pillars, and architectural metaphors for spiritual construction. Some Masonic degrees explicitly reference Gnostic themes, though Masonry was not itself a Gnostic movement. The point is that Gnostic ideas about sacred geometry, mystical architecture, and hidden knowledge found expression in fraternal orders that preserved esoteric traditions. The 19th century saw revival of interest in Gnosticism among occultists and esotericists. Madame Blavatsky, founder of Theosophy, drew on Gnostic sources in constructing her synthesis of Eastern and Western spirituality. The Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, a magical society in Britain, incorporated Gnostic concepts into its initiatory system. These movements were not attempts to reconstruct historical Gnosticism, but rather to adapt Gnostic ideas to modern spiritual seeking. Carl Jung, the Swiss psychologist, encountered Gnostic ideas early in his career and found in them a language for psychological processes he observed in patients and himself. Jung interpreted Gnostic myths as symbolic representations of individuation, the process by which the unconscious becomes conscious and the personality becomes whole. The demiurge represented the ego's limited perspective. The pleroma represented the self, the totality of consciousness. Gnosis was psychological insight that healed the split between conscious and unconscious. Jung's 7 Sermons to the Dead, a mystical text he wrote in 1916, expressed these ideas in language deliberately evoking Gnostic sources. He attributed the sermons to Basilides, the 2nd century Gnostic teacher. The text spoke of the pleroma, the union of opposites, and the dead souls seeking knowledge. Jung later distanced himself from this work, embarrassed by its mystical excess, but it demonstrated his deep engagement with Gnostic symbolism. The 20th century witnessed an explosion of scholarly work on Gnosticism. The discovery of the Nag Hammadi library provided primary sources that previous generations had lacked. For the first time since the 4th century, scholars could read what Gnostics themselves wrote rather than relying solely on hostile descriptions from heresiologists. This transformed the field. Early scholarly responses focused on basic descriptive work, translating texts, identifying their dates and provenance, determining their relationships to known movements and ideas. This work was essential and continues to this day. But alongside the philological and historical labour came interpretive debates that revealed divergent agendas. Some scholars approached Gnosticism with sympathy, seeing in it a form of Christianity that might have been more intellectually sophisticated, more gender equal, more mystical than the orthodox Christianity that won. These scholars tended to emphasize the diversity of early Christianity and to question whether the proto-orthodox position deserved its victory. They suggested that historical accident rather than inherent superiority determined which form of Christianity became dominant. Other scholars approached Gnosticism more critically, seeing in it fundamental problems that explain why it was rejected. These scholars emphasized Gnostic world rejection, the implications of viewing matter as evil, the potential for spiritual elitism, and the instability of movements based on individual revelation rather than communal authority and tradition. They argued that Orthodox Christianity's emphasis on incarnation, material creation as good, and salvation as bodily resurrection offered a healthier spiritual vision. Hans Jonas represented the sympathetic camp. His The Gnostic Religion, first published in 1958 but revised after the Nag Hammadi discoveries, interpreted Gnosticism as an existential response to cosmic alienation. Jonas, influenced by his teacher Martin Heidegger, read Gnostic texts as expressing fundamental human experiences, being thrown into a world not of one's choosing, feeling alienated from one's surroundings, seeking authentic existence against the pressures of conformity, confronting anxiety and meaninglessness. Jonas argued that Gnosticism was the first philosophy of existentialism, the Gnostic sense of being a stranger in a hostile cosmos, of containing a divine spark that did not belong to the material world, of needing to awaken from sleep and remember one's true origin. All of this resonated with 20th century existential philosophy. The cross in Jonas's reading symbolized the existential crisis, the place where human being confronts its own finitude and mortality, where choice becomes urgent, where authentic existence demands rejection of comfortable illusions. Kurt Rudolph, a German scholar, provided comprehensive historical treatment in Gnosis, the nature and history of Gnosticism. Rudolph was more measured in his judgments, neither celebrating nor condemning Gnosticism, but attempting to understand it within its historical context. He emphasized the diversity within Gnostic movements and warned against treating Gnosticism as a unified phenomenon. Different teachers and communities had different ideas, and modern scholars should not homogenize them. On the cross specifically, Rudolph noted the range of Gnostic interpretations, the cross as cosmic boundary, as instrument of revelation, as symbol of illusory suffering, as diagram of the pleroma. He argued that Gnostics were not univocally rejecting the crucifixion, but reinterpreting it according to their distinct understandings of Christ's nature and mission. The diversity of Gnostic cross symbolism reflected broader theological diversity. Elaine Pagels brought Gnostic studies to popular attention. Her scholarly work was rigorous, but her gift was making complex ideas accessible. The Gnostic Gospels won both the National Book Critics Circle Award and the National Book Award, remarkable for an academic work on ancient religion. Pagels' book appeared in 1979, at a moment when American culture was particularly receptive to its themes. Pagels emphasized gender in her interpretation. She noted that Gnostic texts featured female disciples receiving special teaching, divine female figures playing important roles in cosmology, and metaphors describing God in feminine as well as masculine terms. She contrasted this with Orthodox Christianity's increasing patriarchy, its all-male priesthood, its subordination of women. The Gnostic texts, she suggested, preserved memories of a more egalitarian early Christianity. Critics argued that Pagels overstated the case. Yes, some Gnostic texts featured prominent female figures, but Gnostic groups were not necessarily more egalitarian than Orthodox communities. Some Gnostic texts contained misogynistic passages. The Gospel of Thomas ended with Peter saying that women were not worthy of life, and Jesus responding that he would make Mary male so she could enter the kingdom. Hardly a feminist manifesto, defenders of Pagels replied that even problematic passages like the ending of Thomas could be read as critiques of gender essentialism. If femaleness represented materiality and maleness represented spirituality, then making Mary male meant helping her transcend material limitation. precisely what all Gnostics, male and female, were supposed to do. The point was not biological femaleness, but spiritual transformation beyond gender categories. These debates about interpretation revealed that scholarship is never purely objective. Scholars bring their own concerns, their own cultural context, their own preferences to the text they study. 20th century scholars projecting existentialist, feminist, or postmodern readings onto ancient texts were doing what interpreters have always done, finding in the past resources for addressing present concerns. The question of the cross became enmeshed in these larger interpretive battles. Scholars sympathetic to Gnosticism emphasized its psychological and mystical dimensions, reading the cross as a symbol of inner transformation. Scholars critical of Gnosticism emphasized its dogmatism and world rejection, arguing that the Gnostic cross emptied Christianity of its historical anchor and ethical demand. Bentley Layton, an American scholar, attempted to cut through interpretive debates by providing careful translations and minimal commentary. His collection, The Gnostic Scriptures, became a standard reference, presenting texts in readable English with just enough introduction to Orient readers. Layton believed that the texts should speak for themselves without scholars imposing grand theories. But even this approach involved choices. Which text to include? How to translate ambiguous phrases? What context to provide? Complete objectivity was impossible. The very category Gnostic Scriptures was a construction, grouping together texts from different times, places, and communities under a label they would not have recognized. Beyond academic debates, Gnostic ideas about the cross seeped into popular culture. Artists, writers, filmmakers, and musicians discovered in Gnostic texts a source of alternative mythology, philosophical depth, and countercultural credibility. The idea that reality might be illusory, that hidden knowledge could liberate, that the world was created by a malevolent demiurge rather than a benevolent god, these themes resonated with 20th century anxieties and creative imaginations. Jorge Luis Borges, the Argentine writer, was fascinated by Gnostic texts. His short stories often explored metaphysical labyrinths, alternative cosmologies, and the instability of reality. In Tlern Ukbar Orbis Tertius, he described a fictional world whose existence became increasingly real, suggesting that reality itself might be a kind of idealistic construct. In the Library of Babel, he imagined a vast library containing all possible books, a metaphor for infinite meaninglessness, demanding that individuals create their own meaning, a very Gnostic predicament. Borges's essay, A Vindication of the Kabbalah, defended the Jewish mystical tradition of finding multiple meanings in Scripture through numerology and allegory. He extended this defense to Gnostics, arguing that their mythological creativity and allegorical boldness represented intellectual vitality rather than heretical deviation. For Borges, the Gnostic project of reading cosmic meaning into every detail of creation paralleled the writer's project of creating alternative worlds through language. Philip K. Dick, the science fiction writer, underwent a series of mystical experiences in 1974 that he spent the rest of his life trying to interpret. He became convinced that the Roman Empire had never ended, but continued in secret control of the world, that time might be an illusion, and that the material world was a prison from which Gnosis offered escape. His novel Valis, Vast Active Living Intelligence System, drew explicitly on Gnostic ideas, featuring a character who receives revelations about the nature of reality. Dick's Exegesis, a massive collection of his theological and philosophical speculations, was published posthumously. In it he wrestled with Gnostic interpretations of Christianity, sometimes embracing them, sometimes rejecting them. He was particularly fascinated by the idea that Christ's crucifixion might have been illusory, that what seemed to be suffering was actually something else entirely. The cross represented for Dick the fundamental uncertainty about reality. We cannot trust our perceptions. We cannot know what truly happened. We are trapped in what might be a simulation or prison, and only Gnosis, direct experiential knowledge, can break through the illusion. The Nag Hammadi Library in English was published by Harper and Row in 1977, making the texts accessible to general readers for the first time. The publisher's decision to release these texts as a trade book rather than an academic volume reflected expectations of significant public interest. Those expectations were met. The book sold well and introduced thousands of readers to texts like the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Philip, and the Apocryphon of John. New Age movements embraced Gnostic ideas enthusiastically. The emphasis on hidden knowledge accessible to the initiated fit perfectly with New Age eclecticism. The distinction between the unknowable supreme God and the ignorant creator God could be mapped onto various Eastern distinctions between Brahman and Brahma, or Western esoteric distinctions between the absolute and the demiurge. The call to awaken from illusion resonated with both Buddhist teachings about Maya and countercultural suspicion of mainstream reality. The Jesus Seminar, a group of scholars who met from 1985 to 2006 to determine the authentic sayings of Jesus, gave serious attention to the Gospel of Thomas. Some seminar participants argued that Thomas, though not included in the New Testament, preserved very early traditions about Jesus as a wisdom teacher. They suggested that the Gospel of Thomas might be as historically valuable as the canonical Gospels. This was controversial. Most New Testament scholars rejected the Jesus Seminar's methodology and conclusions, but it demonstrated that Gnostic texts were now part of scholarly conversation about Christian origins. Film embraced Gnostic themes, sometimes explicitly, sometimes implicitly. The Matrix, released in 1999, presented a world where most humans lived in an illusion, unaware that their physical reality was a computer simulation. The film's protagonist, Neo, awakens to the true nature of reality and learns to manipulate the laws of the simulated world. Morpheus, his teacher, offers him a choice between a red pill revealing truth and a blue pill maintaining comfortable illusion. The film's philosophy drew on multiple sources: Plato's cave, Buddhist emptiness, postmodern simulacra, but the basic structure was thoroughly Gnostic. The world is a false creation, a malevolent intelligence controls it, and salvation requires gnosis. The film included explicit Christian imagery, including a scene where Neo is killed and resurrected, arms spread in cruciform position. But the crucifixion in the Matrix was not Orthodox Christian. Neo died fighting the system, and his death revealed the illusory nature of the system's power over him. When he resurrected, he did so with abilities that proved the simulation could not constrain him. The cross, even implied rather than explicit, functioned as the Gnostic moment of revelation and transformation rather than as sacrificial atonement. The Da Vinci Code, Dan Brown's 2003 novel, was less philosophically sophisticated but reached a massive audience. The book featured a conspiracy involving secret knowledge about Jesus and Mary Magdalene. While not primarily about Gnosticism, it referenced Nag Hammadi texts and suggested that Orthodox Christianity had suppressed alternative traditions. The book's success, over 80 million copies sold, demonstrated public appetite for narratives challenging conventional Christian history. Musicians referenced Gnostic themes. Tool, a progressive rock band, included lyrics drawing on esoteric traditions including Gnosticism. Their album Lateralis featured artwork with geometric patterns reminiscent of mystical diagrams, including crosses and spirals suggesting spiritual ascent. Bands in metal genres which often explored occult and esoteric themes incorporated Gnostic cosmology into their lyrics and visual imagery. The rediscovery of Gnostic texts created not just academic interest, but religious crisis for some Christians. If early Christianity was more diverse than previously thought, if alternatives to Orthodox Christianity had existed and been suppressed, if texts excluded from the Bible contained valuable insights, then what did this mean for Christian faith today? Could one be both Christian and Gnostic? Should the Church reconsider its historical rejection of Gnostic ideas? Some Christians responded with firm rejection. The Gnostic texts, they insisted, were rightly excluded from the canon. They represented departures from apostolic teaching. and the Church Fathers were correct to condemn them. The rediscovery of these texts was historically interesting but theologically irrelevant. Orthodox Christianity had won not through political power alone, but because its understanding of Jesus and salvation was true. Others responded with creative retrieval. Perhaps Gnostic texts contained insights that could enrich Christian theology without requiring wholesale rejection of orthodoxy. The emphasis on divine mystery, on multiple levels of scriptural meaning, on the limitations of language about God, on spiritual experience rather than merely doctrine. All of these Gnostic themes had parallels in Orthodox mystical tradition. Maybe the boundary between orthodoxy and heresy was not as absolute as once thought. Elaine Pagel's Beyond Belief, The Secret Gospel of Thomas, explored this question personally. Pagel's described how the death of her young son and later her husband led her to question conventional religious answers to suffering. She found that the Gospel of John's insistence on faith and the Gospel of Thomas's emphasis on seeking resonated with different aspects of her experience. John offered community and tradition. Thomas offered individual spiritual exploration. Must one choose between them, or could both have value? Pagel's concluded that Christians could learn from Gnostic texts without accepting all Gnostic doctrines. She did not advocate reviving Gnosticism as a movement, but suggested that the diversity of early Christianity should inspire humility about claims to possess the only correct interpretation. The Church Fathers who condemned Gnosticism were defending their understanding of truth, which is legitimate. But that does not mean they were right about everything or that those they condemned had nothing valuable to offer. Other scholars were less conciliatory. Luke Timothy Johnson, a Catholic New Testament scholar, published The Real Jesus in response to what he saw as distortions of Christian history by the Jesus Seminar and popular writers emphasizing Gnostic texts. Johnson argued that the New Testament documents were far better historical sources than later Gnostic texts, that Orthodox Christianity developed naturally from Jesus' teaching and the apostles' experience of his resurrection, and that attempts to replace or even supplement this orthodoxy with Gnostic ideas fundamentally misunderstood Christianity. On the cross specifically, Johnson insisted that the resurrection validated the crucifixion's meaning. Jesus truly died and was truly raised, and these historical events created Christianity. Gnostic attempts to reinterpret the crucifixion as symbolic or illusory emptied Christianity of its specific historical claims. Christianity was not a timeless myth or mystical philosophy that could be detached from history. It was inextricably tied to particular events, the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth. The debate revealed different understandings of religious authority and truth. Those sympathetic to retrieving Gnostic insights tended to emphasize individual spiritual experience, diversity of interpretation, and the limits of institutional authority. Those defending orthodox exclusion of Gnostic ideas tended to emphasize apostolic tradition, communal discernment, and the coherence of orthodox theology across centuries. The Gnostic Society, founded in Los Angeles in the 1920s and revived in the 1960s, represented an attempt to practice Gnosticism as a living religion rather than merely study it historically. The Society held lectures, offered courses, and provided resources for people interested in Gnostic spirituality. They were not trying to recreate second-century Gnosticism, but to adapt its insights to contemporary spiritual seeking. Similar groups emerged in various places. Some were neo-Gnostic churches claiming apostolic succession through obscure esoteric lineages. Others were study circles exploring Gnostic texts as philosophy and mythology rather than revealed truth. Still others were artistic communities, using Gnostic symbolism as creative inspiration. None represented historical continuity with ancient Gnosticism that had been broken centuries ago, but they demonstrated ongoing fascination with Gnostic ideas. The question of the cross remained central. Could one venerate the cross while believing that Jesus did not truly suffer on it? Could one take the Eucharist while thinking the body and blood were merely symbols pointing to spiritual realities rather than the actual body of Christ? Could one recite creeds affirming that Jesus suffered under Pontius Pilate, while understanding this suffering as illusory or symbolic? For most contemporary Christians, the answer was no. The reality of the crucifixion, the physical, historical, painful death of Moses, was non-negotiable. To deny this was to cease being Christian in any recognizable sense. But for those attracted to Gnostic ideas, this seemed unnecessarily limiting. Why couldn't Christianity accommodate multiple interpretations, multiple levels of meaning? Why must one choose between literal historical truth and symbolic spiritual truth? The tension reflected a broader cultural divide. Modern Western culture increasingly valued pluralism, individual choice, and skepticism toward institutional authority. Many people constructed their own spiritual paths, borrowing elements from different traditions. For such seekers, Gnostic texts offered resources that felt less dogmatic, more open to personal interpretation than traditional Christianity. Yet others argued that this eclecticism missed what was distinctive and powerful about religious traditions. Christianity made specific claims about God, humanity, sin, and salvation. It was not a buffet from which one could select appealing items while leaving others behind. The coherence of Christian theology depended on the interconnection of its doctrines. Remove the historical reality of the crucifixion, and the entire structure collapsed. Marvin Meyer, a scholar who devoted his career to Gnostic texts, tried to bridge these positions. Meyer translated numerous Nag Hammadi texts and wrote extensively about their religious significance. He was trained as a Lutheran pastor before becoming an academic, and he maintained that Gnostic texts could deepen Christian faith rather than undermine it. Meyer suggested that the Gnostic emphasis on the divine spark within each person complemented rather than contradicted Orthodox teaching about being created in God's image. The Gnostic call to awaken from ignorance paralleled Jesus' call to repent, to change one's thinking. On the cross, Meyer acknowledged the fundamental difference between Gnostic and Orthodox interpretations, but he suggested that even docetic passages might be read generously. When Gnostic texts said Jesus did not suffer, perhaps they meant his divine nature remained undiminished by suffering, not that his human nature felt no pain. When they described him laughing, perhaps they meant he maintained spiritual joy even in agony, an idea not alien to Orthodox martyrdom accounts, which often depicted martyrs as serene or joyful in the face of torture. These Irenic readings had limits. The Gnostic texts said what they said. The second treatise of the Great Seth explicitly described Simon of Cyrene being crucified in Jesus' place. The Apocalypse of Peter explicitly distinguished between the fleshly body on the cross and the living Jesus standing apart. These were not ambiguous passages that could easily be harmonized with orthodoxy. They represented a genuinely different understanding of what happened at Golgotha. Perhaps then the value of Gnostic texts for contemporary Christians was not in adopting their specific doctrines, but in their capacity to provoke questions. What does it mean that God suffers? If God truly suffered on the cross, does that mean God can change, can be affected by creation, can experience genuine loss and pain? Orthodox theology affirmed divine impassibility. God cannot suffer, while simultaneously affirming that Jesus suffered. How could both be true if Jesus was divine? The Orthodox answer involved Christological complexity. Jesus had two natures, human and divine, and the human nature suffered while the divine nature remained impassible. But this was itself a sophisticated theological move not far removed from Gnostic distinctions between the Christ and Jesus. Gnostic texts, by pushing these questions to extreme conclusions, helped clarify what was at stake. They revealed that the crucifixion's meaning could not be taken for granted, but required careful theological articulation. They demonstrated that early Christians struggled with the same paradoxes and tensions that later theology tried to resolve. They showed that the cross was never a simple symbol, but always required interpretation. The cross as a symbol transcends Christianity. Long before Jesus walked to Golgotha, human beings were making crosses, drawing them, carving them, constructing them. And long after Christianity emerged, cultures with no knowledge of Christian tradition independently developed cross symbolism. This universality suggests that the cross taps into something fundamental in human consciousness, something archetypal. The equal-armed cross, 4 lines of equal length radiating from a centre point, appears in Neolithic art. Cave paintings and pottery from diverse cultures feature this simple geometric form. Sometimes it marks the cardinal directions, north, south, east, west. Sometimes it represents the sun, with rays extending outward. Sometimes it divides space into 4 quadrants, organising reality through quaternary symbolism. Ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics included the Ankh, a cross with a loop at the top. The Ankh symbolised life, specifically eternal life. Gods were depicted holding Ankhs, offering them to pharaohs. The symbol suggested the intersection of temporal and eternal, the gift of immortality from the divine realm to the human. Though not directly ancestral to the Christian cross, the Ankh demonstrates that cross-like symbols could carry profound religious meaning millennia before Christianity. The swastika, before its appropriation and corruption by Nazism, was an ancient symbol found across Eurasia. A cross with arms bent at right angles, it appeared in Hindu, Buddhist, and Jain contexts as an auspicious symbol representing the sun, prosperity, and cosmic order. In the Americas, indigenous peoples independently developed similar designs. The Hopi used a whirling cross symbol in their cosmology. The universality of this rotating cross design suggests it represents something humans naturally discover. Perhaps the experience of the sun's apparent motion, or the cycle of seasons, or the human impulse to mark the 4 directions. Mircea Eliade, in his comprehensive study of religious symbolism, argued that the cross represented the intersection of horizontal and vertical axes that structures human experience. Space, the vertical axis connects above and below. Heaven and earth, transcendence and immanence. The horizontal axis extends in the plane of lived experience, organising reality into before and behind, left and right. Where these axes meet, at the centre, is the sacred spot, the point of orientation, the place from which the world makes sense. Traditional societies mark this centre with sacred poles, sending stones, or constructed monuments. The totem pole of Pacific Northwest indigenous peoples functioned as a vertical axis connecting human community to ancestral spirits. The omphalos stones at Greek sacred sites like Delphi mark the navel or centre of the world. The cosmic mountain in Hindu and Buddhist cosmology, Mount Meru, stood at the centre of the universe, its peak in heaven, its base in the underworld, with the earthly realm arranged around it. Christian churches were built to embody this sacred geography. The floor plan of a traditional church forms a cross, with the long nave extending east-west and the transept crossing it north-south. The intersection, the crossing, is the most sacred space, often marked by a dome or tower reaching heavenward. The altar sits near this crossing, marking it as the place where heaven touches earth, where the sacrifice of the Mass represents Christ's sacrifice, where transformation occurs. Medieval Christians developed elaborate symbolic interpretations of church architecture. The building itself was a cross, representing Christ's body crucified for the world. The east-facing orientation placed the altar toward Jerusalem, toward the rising sun, toward the anticipated return of Christ. The vertical dimension, floor to ceiling, earth to roof, represented the ascent from earthly concerns to heavenly contemplation. To enter a church was to enter the cross, to position oneself within its geometry, to be reminded bodily of the crucifixion's centrality. This architectural symbolism reached its apex in Gothic cathedrals. Chartres, Notre Dame de Paris, Reims. These massive structures pushed vertical aspiration to new heights. Their spires seemed to pierce the sky. Inside, stone columns soared upward, creating artificial groves that drew the eye and the soul toward transcendence. Light filtered through stained glass, transforming the interior into a mystical space, halfway between earth and heaven. The entire structure taught theology through form. The material world could become transparent to the divine, matter could bear it, the cross could be inhabited. But this Christian development participated in patterns larger than Christianity. Buddhist stupas were also constructed as cosmic diagrams, with levels representing stages of enlightenment and a spire extending upwards to represent ultimate reality. Hindu temples were built as representations of the cosmic mountain, with towers symbolizing peaks where gods dwelt. Islamic mosques oriented worshippers toward Mecca and featured minarets reaching upward, vertical structures punctuating horizontal space. The human body itself exhibits cross-like symmetry. We stand upright, our spines vertical, defying gravity. Our arms extend horizontally, creating bilateral symmetry. The intersection is the heart, the center of physical life. Early Christians noted this correspondence. To spread one's arms in prayer or supplication was to form a cross with one's body, to embody the symbol physically. Crucifixion exploited this correspondence horrifically. By nailing a person in cruciform position, Romans created a perverse living icon, the human body as cross. Victims were displayed at major crossroads, their bodies echoing the crossed roads, their suffering visible to all who passed. The execution method transformed the human form into a public symbol of Roman power and the consequence of challenging that power. When Christians adopted the cross as their central symbol, they were reclaiming and transforming what had been an instrument of state terror. But they were also tapping into the deeper meaning that the cross-shaped human body suggested. The intersection of dimensions, the vertical and horizontal, the aspiration toward transcendence and the reality of embodiment. Leonardo da Vinci's Vitruvian Man illustrated this perfectly. A human figure with arms and legs extended, inscribed within both a circle and a square, demonstrated the proportions and symmetries of the ideal body. The figure suggested both the cross, arms horizontal, body vertical, and the mandala, the circular form representing wholeness and perfection. Renaissance thinkers saw in this geometry proof that humans were microcosms, containing within themselves the structure of the macrocosm. Modern science revealed additional cross patterns. DNA, the molecule carrying genetic information, forms a double helix, two spirals intertwined, connected by base pairs extending horizontally from the vertical spiraling backbones. The structure could be visualized as multiple crosses stacked and twisted, the horizontal base pairs connecting the vertical sugar-phosphate backbones. The molecule of life itself exhibited cruciform geometry. Coordinate systems in mathematics and physics use perpendicular axes, a horizontal x and vertical y in 2 dimensions, with a third perpendicular z-axis added for 3-dimensional space. These Cartesian coordinates, named for René Descartes, organize mathematical space through intersecting lines. Every point in space can be specified by its position relative to these axes. The cross becomes the fundamental structure for mapping reality. Anatomically, the human nervous system exhibits cross-shaped organization. The spinal cord extends vertically. Nerves branch horizontally from the spine to reach all parts of the body. The brain sits atop this vertical column, itself organized into left and right hemispheres, connected by the corpus callosum, another crossing, another intersection requiring communication and integration. These scientific observations do not prove mystical claims about the cross, but they suggest why cross symbolism resonates so deeply. Humans encounter crosses not as arbitrary cultural constructs, but as structures embedded in reality, in our bodies, in our spatial experience, in the fundamental architecture of life. When Gnostics interpreted the cross as revealing cosmic structure, they were not inventing meaning from nothing. They were articulating an intuition that cross-shaped patterns organize existence at multiple levels. The dialogue between science and religion regarding the cross moved beyond pattern recognition to philosophical questions about reductionism and meaning. Can the psychological and neurological bases of religious experience explain away that experience, or do they merely describe the mechanisms through which something genuine is apprehended? Neuroscientists studying religious experience identified specific brain states associated with mystical consciousness. Meditation, prayer, and contemplation produced measurable changes in brain activity. The parietal lobe, which processes spatial orientation and body boundaries, showed decreased activity during profound mystical experiences. Subjects reported losing the sense of where their body ended and the world began. Precisely the dissolution of boundaries that mystics describe as union with the divine. Did this mean mystical experience was merely brain activity? Or did it mean the brain was capable of perceiving realities beyond ordinary consciousness? The question paralleled an old philosophical debate. When we see the colour blue, our experience correlates with specific wavelengths of light and neural processing. But the subjective experience of blueness, what philosophers call qualia, is not reducible to wavelengths or neurons. Similarly, mystical experience might correlate with brain states without being nothing more than brain states. The cross, in this context, could be understood as a symbol that facilitates certain psychological and spiritual processes. Meditating on the cross, visualizing it, contemplating its geometry, experiencing it through liturgy and art, might activate neural pathways associated with integration, transcendence, and meaning-making. The symbol worked not through arbitrary association, but through its correspondence with deep structures of consciousness. Carl Jung had argued something similar. He believed symbols were not mere signs, arbitrarily pointing to meanings, but rather that powerful symbols participated in what they symbolized. The cross was effective as a religious symbol because it corresponded to archetypal structures in the collective unconscious. When someone encountered the cross and felt its power, they were not experiencing cultural conditioning alone. They were resonating with patterns fundamental to human psychology. Jung's concept of synchronicity, meaningful coincidence, suggested that patterns could appear simultaneously in inner and outer reality without causal connection. When a Gnostic contemplated the cross as cosmic axis and then noticed cross patterns in nature, Jung might say this was not mere projection, but rather recognition of genuine correspondence. The universe and the psyche shared common structures, and symbols mediated between them. Physicist Wolfgang Pauli, who collaborated with Jung, explored whether quantum mechanics suggested a deeper unity of matter and mind. At the quantum level, observation affected reality. The observer and observed could not be cleanly separated. Pauli speculated that consciousness and matter might be complementary aspects of a unified reality, like the two sides of a coin. If so, then mystical claims about the interpenetration of spirit and matter were not necessarily primitive superstition, but potential insights into the nature of reality. These speculations remained controversial and unproven. Most scientists maintain that consciousness was an emergent property of complex neural processing, explainable in principle through physical processes. The feeling that consciousness transcends matter was an illusion created by the brain's self-reflective capacities. Mystical experiences were interesting neurological phenomena, but did not provide knowledge of external metaphysical realities. Yet even materialist neuroscience acknowledged mystery. How exactly does consciousness arise from neural activity? How does subjective experience emerge from objective physical processes? This hard problem of consciousness remained unsolved. Perhaps it was unsolvable in principle, requiring explanations that current science could not provide. The Gnostic claim that consciousness, the divine spark, was not produced by matter, but imprisoned within it, represented one possible answer. Consciousness was primary, not derivative. Matter was the secondary reality, the prison or illusion that trapped awareness. From this perspective, mystical experiences of transcending the body were not hallucinations but genuine escapes from material limitation, temporary liberations of consciousness from its physical constraints. Meditation practices demonstrated that consciousness could be trained to operate in unusual ways. experienced meditators could slow their heart rate, control their body temperature, endure pain without distress, and enter states of consciousness radically different from ordinary awareness. These capacities suggested that the relationship between mind and body was more complex than simple materialist models acknowledged. Perhaps consciousness possessed degrees of freedom that everyday life did not reveal. The cross, as a focus for meditation and contemplation, would serve as a tool for exploring these degrees of freedom. By concentrating on the vertical axis, practitioners might access states of transcendence, moving beyond ordinary bodily consciousness. By concentrating on the horizontal axis, they might explore the full range of embodied experience. By holding both axes simultaneously in awareness, they might achieve integration, the union of transcendence and immanence, spirit and matter, vertical and horizontal. Contemporary practitioners of Christian contemplative prayer sometimes reported experiences similar to those described in ancient Gnostic texts. Deep meditation on the cross could produce visions of light, experiences of ego dissolution, insights into the illusory nature of separate selfhood, and profound peace. These experiences did not require accepting Gnostic theology, but did suggest that Gnostic practices had accessed genuine states of consciousness. Psychedelic research added another dimension. Studies using psilocybin, LSD, and other psychedelics under clinical conditions found that many subjects reported mystical experiences indistinguishable from those described by contemplatives across religious traditions. Subjects described ego death, unity consciousness, encounters with the divine, and insights into the nature of reality. Many said these experiences were among the most meaningful of their lives. Some researchers speculated that mystical states, whether achieved through meditation, prayer, psychedelics, or spontaneous spiritual crisis, represented a kind of perception, an awareness of aspects of reality normally filtered out by ordinary consciousness. The brain, on this view, acted as a reducing valve, limiting consciousness to the narrow band of awareness necessary for survival. Under certain conditions, this filter loosened, allowing broader perception. If so, then Gnostic claims about hidden knowledge and awakening from illusion made sense. Ordinary consciousness was limited, filtered, constrained. Gnosis meant expanding consciousness, perceiving more fully, waking from the dream of materiality. The cross, as a symbol of transformation and transcendence, marked the possibility of this awakening. The 21st century brought the Gnostic texts into the digital age. Online archives made manuscripts and translations available to anyone with internet access. The Gnostic Society Library website provided free access to texts that had been difficult to obtain even for scholars decades earlier. The Nag Hammadi Library could be read in its entirety online. University digitization projects photographed manuscripts in high resolution, allowing scholars and curious readers to examine the actual Coptic script. This democratization of access transformed who could engage with Gnostic ideas. No longer the exclusive domain of academic specialists, these texts became available to spiritual seekers, creative artists, independent researchers, and curious readers worldwide. Online forums and discussion groups formed where people debated interpretations, shared insights, and explored how ancient Gnostic ideas might apply to contemporary life. Simultaneously, the work of textual restoration and translation continued. Coptic fragments scattered in various collections were gradually identified and reunited. Advanced imaging techniques made illegible passages readable. New translations incorporated better understanding of Coptic grammar and idiomatic expressions. The Jung Codex, which had been separated from the rest of the Nag Hammadi library, was finally published in full. Conservation work addressed the deterioration these ancient manuscripts had suffered. Paper and leather that had survived 17 centuries buried in desert sand were now threatened by air pollution, humidity fluctuations, and the acids in the paper itself. Conservators developed methods to stabilize the manuscripts, repair damage, and protect them for future generations. The Coptic Museum in Cairo, which held most of the Nag Hammadi library, improved its storage conditions and security. UNESCO recognized the library's significance by supporting preservation efforts and facilitating scholarly access. International cooperation ensured that these texts, which belong to humanity's collective heritage, would be preserved and studied. The manuscripts were too fragile for casual handling, but high-quality facsimiles made the experience of encountering the actual codices available to visitors. The digital age also brought new forms of engagement with the cross as symbol. Computer graphics allowed creation of complex visual representations of Gnostic cosmologies. Animated diagrams could show the emanation of aeons from the pleroma, the descent of Sophia, the creation of the material world and the soul's ascent through archonic spheres. The cross could be rotated in three-dimensional space, revealing its geometry from multiple angles. Virtual reality opened possibilities for immersive experiences of sacred space. A VR reconstruction of a Valentinian meditation chamber could allow users to sit surrounded by cosmograms, with the cross positioned at the center, experiencing something analogous to what ancient initiates might have experienced. Such technologies raised questions about whether religious experience required physical sacred space or could be mediated through digital simulation. Contemporary artists continued to find inspiration in Gnostic themes. The cross appeared in their work not as traditional Christian iconography, but as mystical geometry, as symbol of consciousness trapped in matter, as marker of the boundary between worlds. Some artists created crosses from unexpected materials, light, sound, digital code, emphasizing the symbol's abstract power beyond any particular physical instantiation. Musicians composed pieces based on Gnostic texts. The cross appeared in song lyrics as metaphor for existential crisis, for the intersection of time and eternity, for crucifixion of the ego required for spiritual awakening. Electronic music, with its capacity for creating otherworldly soundscapes, proved particularly effective at evoking the Gnostic sense of alienation and transcendence. Video games explored Gnostic themes, creating interactive narratives where players discovered that their reality was false, that malevolent powers controlled the world, and that hidden knowledge offered liberation. These games recapitulated the Gnostic myth in digital form, allowing players to experience the narrative of awakening from illusion. The cross appeared as a symbol marking portals between levels of reality, representing the player's progress toward ultimate truth. Academic interest in Gnosticism remained strong. New doctoral dissertations, monographs, and articles appeared regularly, analyzing specific texts, debating interpretations, and connecting Gnostic ideas to broader themes in religious studies, philosophy, and cultural history. Conferences brought together scholars from multiple disciplines to discuss Gnosticism's significance. But alongside academic study, another phenomenon emerged: people attempting to live Gnostic spirituality in contemporary contexts. Small communities formed, some meeting physically, others existing primarily online. They studied ancient texts, but also adapted practices for modern life. They developed rituals drawing on Gnostic symbolism. They explored meditation techniques aimed at achieving gnosis. They discussed how Gnostic perspectives on the material world might inform responses to ecological crisis, digital technology, and political oppression. These contemporary Gnostics did not claim unbroken lineage from ancient movements. The historical chain had been severed, but they argued that Gnostic insights were perennial, not dependent on historical continuity. The experience of alienation from the world, of sensing that material reality was not ultimate reality, of seeking knowledge that transcended conventional understanding. These were universal human experiences that each generation could discover anew. The cross remained central to many of these explorations. Some contemporary Gnostics wore crosses as jewelry, understanding the symbol not as Christians did, but as markers of initiation, of commitment to seeking gnosis, of recognition that one must die to the old self to be reborn. Others meditated on crosses, using the symbol as a focal point for consciousness expansion. Still others studied the geometry of crosses, seeking to understand the mathematical relationships that ancient Gnostics had intuited. The question persisted: was the cross meant to save the world, or expose it? Orthodox Christianity answered definitively: the cross saves through Christ's sacrifice. But Gnostic Christianity had answered differently: the cross exposes the world's illusory nature and reveals the path of escape. Both answers took the cross seriously, but they led in opposite directions, one toward deeper engagement with material existence as redeemed, the other toward transcendence of material existence as false. Perhaps this unresolved tension was itself significant. The cross, positioned at the intersection of vertical and horizontal, of transcendence and immanence, of spirit and matter, resisted resolution into a single meaning. It demanded to be held in tension, like the body of the crucified stretched between opposing poles. To embrace only the vertical was to lose connection with earthly life. To embrace only the horizontal was to lose aspiration toward transcendence. The cross insisted on both at once, the impossible geometry of spiritual life. As the sun rises over the desert near Nag Hammadi, light touches the cliffs where the jar was found. 17 centuries compressed into a moment. The voices preserved in those texts still whisper their provocations. What if the world is not what it seems? What if divinity dwells within you, not above you? What if awakening is possible not in some future heaven, but here, now, through knowledge? What if the cross is not the end of the story, but the beginning? Not closure, but opening, not answer, but question. The cross endures not because it provides certainty, but because it describes the human condition, suspended between dimensions, stretched between knowledge and ignorance, crucified upon the intersection of time and eternity, dying to the old and being reborn to the new. The ancient Gnostics understood this. They made the cross their own, not by denying its power, but by reading it differently, seeing in its geometry not merely an execution device, but a cosmic truth, not merely past event, but present reality, not merely symbol, but map. The desert wind continues to blow over the place where the jar was buried. The texts have been retrieved, translated, studied, debated, but their deepest claim remains unresolved. That reality is not what it appears, that knowledge can liberate, that the cross marks both imprisonment and escape. Whether one accepts these claims or not, they demonstrate the human capacity to find meaning in suffering, pattern in chaos, transcendence within limitation. The cross, reimagined by heretics and preserved through centuries of suppression, stands as testimony to the restless human spirit that refuses to accept easy answers, that continues to question, to seek, to interpret, to find in the older symbols new depths of meaning. The story is not finished. As long as humans ponder existence, as long as symbols carry power, as long as people seek to understand suffering and transcendence, the cross will continue to generate new interpretations. The Gnostic reading, suppressed but never destroyed, rediscovered but still controversial, represents one possibility among many. It reminds us that the symbols we think we understand may harbour hidden depths, that traditions we assume are monolithic were once diverse, that what was lost can sometimes be found, and that even in impotence ideas wait to speak again. In the intersection of vertical and horizontal, in the place where opposites meet, in the geometry of the crucified divine, there the mystery persists, unchanged by time, waiting for each generation to encounter it anew and decide what it means. The hidden symbolism of the cross in Gnosticism was never fully hidden, only waiting to be seen by eyes trained to look beyond the surface, by minds willing to entertain the possibility that the ancient heretics might have glimpsed something true, by hearts open to the dangerous beauty of a God who laughs while the world believes he suffers, who transcends while appearing to die, who reveals precisely by concealing, who saves not through sacrifice, but through knowledge. Gnosis, the light that was always there, crucified upon matter, waiting for recognition, waiting for awakening, waiting for return.